Good evening, everyone, and welcome to America in Crisis. Please welcome the editor of The New Republic, Michael Tomasky.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Those of you here and those of you streaming, thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking the time to come out, and thank you for joining us for America in Crisis 2. Back in February, we had an event, America in Crisis 1. We thought our job was done. Turned out we decided we better have an America in Crisis 2. Because it's getting weirder every week. You don't need me to tell you that. But we have, I think, terrific speakers and terrific panelists tonight to help us all make sense of this and to give us some information and some courage and some resolve to go forward and fight this. With that, I stop and I introduce our first speaker, who we're very pleased to have. The congressman from the 8th District of Illinois, that stretches from the west and northwest suburbs of Chicago. And he was first elected in 2016, and he's on the Oversight Committee, and he's, you may have first noticed him when I did during the first Trump impeachment, the first of 3 or 4, hopefully. And I thought, boy, that guy's asking good questions. He caught my eye then, and I'm very glad he's here tonight. Please welcome Representative Raja Krishnamoorthi.
Good evening. It's an honor to be with you. It's an honor to be any place they can pronounce my name correctly. This is a true story. I'm not making this up. When I first ran for office in Illinois, I said, "Hi, my name is Raja Krishnamoorthi," and the person in Chicago looked right back at me and said, "Roger Christian Murphy." And I said, "I didn't know the Irish made it to India." And so, in any case, it's wonderful to be with you. I'd like to observe those 3 rules of public speaking: be short, be sweet, and be gone. First of all, can you give a big round of applause to Michael and to the New Republic for having this big event? I'm told that there are upwards of 1,000 people streaming live this presentation, so thank you to all of you at home who are joining us virtually. Maybe I'll just tell you a little bit about my background and why I feel, based on my own background and experience, we are in a crisis. I was born in India. I came to this country when I was 3 months old, to Buffalo, New York, where my father was studying engineering, and things were going great until suddenly they did not, in the recession of 1973. But at that point, my father lost his income, but thanks to the generosity of the American people and its government, we were allowed to move into public housing and food stamps. So I spent about half of my early childhood in those 2 life-sustaining programs. And thanks to the generosity of the American people, we were allowed to stay. My father got back on his feet, completed his education, and then got a great job in, of all places, Peoria, Illinois. So they loaded up the U-Haul and started driving and driving until they reached Peoria. And that's really where we entered the middle class. And pretty much every night at the dinner table, I'm paraphrasing, but my father would say, "Think of the greatness of this country. Think of the greatness of this country. And whatever the 2 of you do, my brother and me, just make sure it's there for the next families who need it." So fast forward through college and law school, stints in the private and public sector. 5 terms later, in the United States Congress, I'm pursuing that mission statement given to me by my parents, which is make sure this country is there for the next families who need it. And so, folks, like many of you, I have lived the American dream. But that dream is under assault. It is under threat. For that reason, I believe we are in a crisis. Just look at what enabled me to be where I am. That legal immigration system It is being systematically dismantled before our very eyes. That public housing and food stamps, now known as SNAP, is literally on the chopping block today in Congress. In fact, it was in committee cut to the tune of $230 billion today in the Agriculture Committee of the U.S. House. Yes, you should say boo. It is like one of the most vile things you could do, which is to erode someone's food security. And that public school system, I'm a proud product of public schools, is constantly under threat. So much so that President Trump wants to close the Department of Education. And that's all you need to know about this president with regard to his view of upward mobility and the American dream. So basically, we've come to a crossroads as a country, which is this. Do we want a government that enables people to try to make it? Or do we want a government that primarily caters to those who have it made? That is the central question in my humble belief that we are facing today with this government. And I know the answer Donald Trump has, which is he wants a government primarily catering to those who have it made. Whereas I believe we must do everything in our power. We must marshal all of our energy to ensure that this government remains for those who are struggling to make it. I'm talking about the immigrants. I'm talking about single moms. I'm talking about dads who are working a second shift to put a little more food on the table or to ensure that the family can make ends meet. Because the American dream is under threat, because these people cannot access the dream, I believe that they are in a position now where people like Donald Trump and others appeal to their worst instincts in explaining why they are in the position they find themselves in. It's like that old Native American saying, which is, inside each of us is a good wolf and a bad wolf. And the wolf that you become is the wolf you feed. And Donald Trump and others have fed the bad wolves in them, saying that the reason for their plight is that brown guy over there. It's that stranger over there. It's the other. And have effectively scapegoated groups of people to explain the economic plight of the American people today. So, is it any wonder that a Donald Trump, once he comes into power, turns to the other institutions of government to slowly erode their authority, making it even more difficult for people to access the American dream? What do I mean by that? I'm talking, again, about the civil servants in our government who are there to try to provide vital services to people in need. But for that matter, let's talk about the press that is under attack, who exposes what is happening to the people who need those services. And of course, let's talk about DOJ, which is constantly under assault now because it is trying to enforce the laws that would otherwise act as a backstop against someone who would try to undo the services that these people are entitled to. And so that is why America is in crisis. It starts with the American dream under assault and making it harder for people to access the American dream. It continues with entrenching the powerful in positions of power. And it ends with basically going after those institutions that would otherwise act as a backstop to prevent those in power from acting with impunity. And so that is what we're talking about today. And so I just want to say thank you to all of you for paying attention to these issues, and to remember that if we can act together, if we can marshal our energies and attention and hold those who would seek to further undo these institutions that I just talked about accountable for what they're doing, we have a chance. If we don't do these things, however, I fear that authoritarianism is in sight. I fear that the truth will further be one of the casualties of today's actions or inaction. And I fear that we may not recognize the country that my parents came to 52 years ago. So I want to say thank you to all of you for paying attention. Thank you for everything that you do in your own way to hold people accountable. And thank you for your attention to me. Thank you so much. God bless.
Please welcome Cameron Hilaker, Everett Kelley, Skye Perryman, and moderator Tori Otten for Fighting the War on America's Workforce.
Hello, and thank you all so much for joining us in person and online tonight. My name is Tori Otten, and this panel is on fighting against the war on America's workforce. To start, I would like to introduce our panelists. At the very far end, we have Everett Kelley. Everett is the national president, of the American Federation of Government Employees, or AFGE. In his role, which he has held since February 2020, he represents 820,000 federal and DC government workers. Everett has also been an AFG member himself since 1981. Under his leadership, AFGE has been a leading force in the fight to protect the US government and, by extension, our democracy. AFGE has held rallies, brought lawsuits, and waged a public campaign to educate Americans about the importance of apolitical civil service. To that end, he makes frequent public speaking appearances, including tonight, as well as last month at the National Hands Off rally in Washington, and at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders' Fighting Oligarchy tour stop in Folsom, California. Everett has won multiple awards for his leadership and commitment to AFGE and the labor movement, and earlier this month, he was named to Washingtonian Magazine's list of the 500 most influential people in Washington for the 4th year in a row. Everett, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Next to him is Skye Perryman. Skye is a lawyer and the president and CEO of Democracy Forward, a national legal organization that helps defend democracy and progress in the courts. Under her leadership, Democracy Forward has played a main role in protecting Americans from harmful and unlawful executive action, including securing a nationwide order stopping the freeze on federal funding and essential services, blocking executive actions undermining diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, and opposing attempts to undermine public education. Since Donald Trump took office, Skye has helped build crucial coalitions and networks for defending federal workers affected by the government's mass layoffs. She has received widespread recognition for her work, and earlier this year, the New Republic featured her as a woman to watch. Skye, thank you for joining us again. And last but not least, next to me is Cameron Hilaker. Cameron worked at USAID as an emergency manager responding to domestic and international crises. As a leader of the readiness team, his role was to ensure that USAID was able to keep employees and families safe during developing crises, as well as continue to provide crucial life-saving assistance. During his time there, Cameron supported more than 20 emergency responses, including evacuations, disasters, and ordered departures. He was, unfortunately, one of the employees laid off when Elon Musk and Doge took control of the agency at the start of the year. Prior to his tenure at and untimely departure from USAID, Cameron served as a Peace Corps volunteer in South Africa for 3 years, working to combat HIV and AIDS. Cameron does not yet have a fancy magazine-designated title, but we at the New Republic still think he is very interesting, and we're very excited to have him. So, since Trump took office at the start of this year, DOGE has made cuts at more than 24 agencies across the government. There have been nearly 60,000 confirmed cuts, more than 76,000 buyouts, and almost 150,000 more cuts planned that we know of. And almost every judge who has heard one of these cases has blocked it, including a recent win for Skye and Everett just last Friday. So Skye and Everett, I was wondering if, first of all, congratulations on this win. If you could tell us what that case is about and give us an update on where things currently stand in the courts.
You want me to start? Okay. Thank you for having me and for talking about this such an important issue. On Friday, a federal judge ruled that the president's attempt to reorganize and decimate the federal workforce across the federal government was unlawful. And there are a few key parts of what the federal judge ruled, and I think one of the main ones that should concern all of us as people and as Americans is that the judge went to lengths to talk about how the president may well have some policy agendas that around the federal workforce, may have ideas about it, and could even implement some of those ideas, but he has to have the approval of Congress. Like, there's not precedent for a president exerting this much executive authority over agencies that were established by Congress, over programs that Congress put in place to solve people's problems without congressional authority. And so that was one of the major pieces of that opinion. It is the biggest and most comprehensive order that we have had to date, really seeking to protect the Americans that serve all of us in this country, our civil service, and the government, of course, has quickly appealed, and we are, working in the case. And then today, I heard a lot of cheers for the Peace Corps. Earlier today, we amended the case to add the Peace Corps into that case, so hopefully. And I just wanted to say, and Everett will have probably a few comments about the real implications of this case and what it means for the people that serve us, but it has been amazing to get to work with Everett and AFGE and so many unions as well as workers' rights organizations that have really been on the front lines, willing to go into court to try to protect the people that serve all of us.
I don't know that there's a lot more for me to add at this point. I'm just grateful for people like Skye and her organization that have been right there with AFGE and other unions all the way. Because this fight and this battle is not just about federal employees, okay? But this is about, what's fair and what's right for Americans, okay? Because this is an attack not just against federal workers, but against America, because what we have to understand that if this administration is successful in dismantling your government system, they're coming after all of us, okay? So that's the point that I just wanted to make on that, Skye. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think we all know generally that these cuts have been made, but Cameron, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how the cuts played out once Elon Musk and DOGE took over, and what happened specifically at USAID, but what happened with the funds once DOGE took over, especially with regard to increasing efficiency and eliminating fraud, as the organization claims it does.
Unfortunately, I think efficiency is now my least favorite word. But at USAID, DOGE was a hostile takeover. I'll be honest with y'all. In even my wildest dreams of what would have happened during Trump 2, this was not a possibility. My colleagues and I game planned. We thought, hey, what is the likelihood? What do we think will happen? We did not anticipate a hostile takeover, and that's what it was. DOGE barged into USAID. You'll forgive the timeline here, but in early February, there was actually an altercation over the weekend while Elon Musk was tweeting about feeding USAID into the wood chipper. DOGE agents were barreling their way past our, deputy chief of security, our deputy director of security, to get access to the SCIF, the highest top secret kind of files that USAID has. And DOGE continued their steamrolling. They steamrolled their way into our financial system, Phoenix, which, part of the civics lesson, right, is that there's a lot of congressional oversight. And Congress is very, very, very particular about where every penny goes because they want to make sure, when we are providing life-saving aid, we're providing it to the right people and we are not inadvertently, supporting terrorist organizations. So Congress will really hound us. And we had, I have to say, a financial system that was easily, top of the class across the U.S. government. This was a system that would track every penny everywhere it went across the globe. DOGE completely smashed it. But in their process of smashing it, they continued to try to make payments. So what ended up happening is you've got, these kind of 23-year-olds who have just broken a world-class financial system that was able to track every single dollar and where it went, and they have replaced it with, some kind of ad hoc duct-taped machinery that, I have no doubt has absolutely overpaid vendors, has sent money to the wrong places. They had to rescind funds, and all of that, would absolutely have gotten me fired, if any of this was played out over congressional oversight. They would have said that is an absolutely illegal act. That is a absolutely reckless action, and my head would have been on the chopping block. But because it's DOGE, they were able to dismantle USAID and really destroy an agency, unfortunately.
Yeah, there's a sort of sixth sense of irony about all of this. I know, Everett, you wrote for Newsweek last month about how it's interesting that Elon Musk is firing probationary workers for poor performance reviews, quote unquote, when he's essentially a probationary worker with a pretty terrible performance review himself. Could you speak a little more about that?
About his probationary appointment himself? Well, first of all, that's a great question because there has been such a misrepresentation as to who probationary employees are, what they do, and the record that they have attained as a federal employee. Probationary employees are not necessarily a person that's newly hired within the federal government, okay? It could be one that has been a 20-year career employee that got a promotion, okay? And during that period of a year, of oversight, they are called a probationary employee, okay? These people were fired and they was told that the reason you were fired because you are underperforming, okay, which misrepresents the truth, which affect adversely, these employees, because now, they are fired from their job, okay, now they go into the job hunt, okay, and they're looking for another job, and stained on their record is a firing for non-production, okay? That hurts these employees, and it's unjust, it's unfair, and the judge ruled that, they were just lying, but that doesn't erase the fact that now there's a stain on the record. Now, AFGE is going to continue to work, and especially with Democracy Forward and other unions and groups, to make sure that we fight for every employee that have had their record stained because of these illegal acts, okay?
So how are you all keeping morale up right now among civil servants? I can imagine that being fired, having to fight constantly is exhausting. So for all three of you, how are you sort of keeping people inspired?
I'll just say at Democracy Forward, of course, we have the honor of working both with current civil servants as well as civil servants who still have a heart of service, still believe in the mission that they were working towards, but that have been eliminated from the federal government as a result of unlawful actions. And what is amazing about every single client that we work with and every single person that we have come in contact with that has gone through what is happening is that they remain so committed to the American people and to the willingness to serve. and are choosing every day to go into court, to use every tool that they can possibly use to help civil servants who can remain within the government, to help their colleagues who have also been unfairly eliminated. At Democracy Forward, we launched an initiative called Civil Service Strong, and I encourage you to go to the civilservicestrong.org website so that civil servants can find community, can be referred for legal advice or other types of services, can find the unions that they may need for both civil servants and former civil servants. And so our team just feels so incredibly honored to get to work with the civil servants, but also what we have seen is a deep concern about the American people and about the service that people provide, and much less of a concern that individual civil servants or former civil servants are having about their own well-being. And I think that is something that is really astonishing and quite inspiring.
You know, what I'm proud about is the fact that the employees that I represent are very patriotic employees. I mean, they will go to work and they'll do that job even in the midst of threats, adversities, whatever. They're going to do that job, and they're going to do it well. You know, they are committed, and, you know, it becomes easy for me as the leader of this federation to offer inspiration. And I think that's my job. I think that is totally my job as a man of faith and a pastor for 31 and a half years, is to be able to offer that inspiration, to give them the little bit of extra that they need to continue this fight, because they will fight. We will fight together. That's the one thing that they have understood, is that if we stand together, you know, we'll win this fight. And I truly believe that it's my job to offer hope, and I try to do that every single day. And they picking up on that, and they are gaining that little extra that they need just to make it through this. If we make it through this, guess what? We now know we can make it through the next thing.
Yep. That's phenomenally important, President Kelley, and to, you know, reiterate that and to really stomp that. You know, there are so many of my colleagues across the federal government that have been fired illegally by DOJ. And what several of us do, we call ourselves a Tuesday group, because every Tuesday, you know, we are out in the Senate Hart Building. We are fired HHS, education, FDA, you know, everybody that's been impacted by DOJ. And what we do is we go around to different senators' offices and we stage a peaceful sit-in where we ask to speak with the senator staff and say, hey, guess what? You know, Chuck Grassley, we would love to speak with you because I don't know if you know this, but Iowa is about to lose, you know, $300 million in Head Start funding. That's going to devastate families in Iowa. Those are your constituents. Senator Cassidy, Louisiana, you are about to experience more storm surge and degradation of your coast than you will ever have seen before. And I am, you know, thrilled to, like President Kelley said, fight and resist along with my federal colleagues every Tuesday at the Senate Hart Building. If there are other fired federal friends, you know, workers, anybody that wants to join us, please. Just last week, we staged a sit-in, on the Capitol building, and we had members of the House, we had senators, you know, come up to us and thank us, you know, say, oh my God, what is this, week 9? You guys are still here? And it's like, yeah, I'm still fired. I got nowhere else to be. But it's that resistance, it's that hope, and it is that, you know what, you might have taken my job away, but we are going to make sure that you know the damage that is being done by DOJ across the United States.
Did you go yesterday?
So it was raining yesterday, so we were in the building. We were at the Hart Building yesterday. But yesterday, let's see if I can remember, we stopped by Dan Sullivan in Alaska, Chuck Grassley in Iowa, because one of our FDA friends, you know, she was like, hey, Chuck Grassley is such, what's a nice way to put this? He is always on top of us when it comes to oversight. Chuck Grassley is always asking questions. He's always asking for more information from the FDA. And she was like, you know what? I'm going to ask him questions now. And so we went to his office and we were like, listen, you know, do you know all of these things are going to impact you and your constituents? So yeah, we did go last Tuesday. It was phenomenal, and we're going to keep going until something changes.
So what message do you have for people who were or maybe still are thinking about going into public service and are now seeing the kind of fight they could be up against?
let me say, first of all, that, it is, and it does look dim at this point. But I continue to encourage people to be a part of the federal government because of the fact, that this is, let me say it like my grandmother would say it, this too shall pass, okay? But this is the very best system one could be employed in, because it is a merit-based system that we have to continue to fight for, but nevertheless, it is the best system one could be employed in. It has great benefits. And so my message is, join in, help us fight this fight so that we can finally solidify the urgency of, being employed as a federal civil servant. So that's my message. Let's do this together, right? If we do it together, when people come into the federal system, they understand why we're doing what we're doing. But we cannot let them diminish the importance and the urgency of our mission.
The late Congresswoman Barbara Jordan used to say public service is the price you pay for the space you take up. And public service is so incredibly important, but it's actually a value that this administration and the political movement that is behind this administration does not want to give oxygen to. They don't understand the idea of people who would swear an oath to the Constitution and to the American people without regard for political ideology, without regard for who was going to get what type of favor. And so I believe that right now one of the greatest forms of service to our country is to continue to believe and to continue to prioritize public service in whatever form that takes. And so that takes, for some of our federal employees right now, going to work every day and doing your job with the same spirit that you've always done the job, even though there are people that want you to quit or to give up or to feel as if that your work is futile, which we know it is not. Right. But it also can mean people who have either been exited improperly and unlawfully from civil service, or others who are looking out over their careers or over their retirements or over what they're going to do with their lives, committing to one thing that they can do every single day in this moment to really be a counterforce to an administration and a political movement that wants to destroy what is the best about this country, which is that we serve each other and that we take care of the people who serve us. So I think that, this is the best time, if there ever was a time, to go into public service, whether that is in government service at the federal level or at the state or local level, or whether that is other forms of service that we can provide in our communities.
Truthfully, I was actually a little terrified to come tonight, and I promise it's not because of public speaking. I'm a ham. I'm happy to be here. No, it's because I'm hearing and seeing in the news that USAID employees are being targeted by the government for speaking out. And I was afraid. I don't know if I'm going to be targeted as a result of this action. But I wore my American flag cufflinks tonight. And this seems like a small thing, but this is deeply personal to me, because I wore them when I swore in to become a government employee, when I took the oath to defend the Constitution. And that is something that is incredibly important to me and to every federal employee. We have all taken that oath to defend the Constitution, and that is something that is worth fighting for. Yes, sir. When it comes to public service, that is what we have to do. We have to remember the oaths that we have taken to this country, to our Constitution, and fight for what is right. So I'm here to do that, to fight, and to let them know that we're not afraid. We are going to keep fighting.
That's good.
All right, we have time for one last question. And I think the thing on everyone's mind is, how do we fight this? What structures are in place to protect fired federal workers, and how can other people get involved?
Well, I'll start by saying, first of all, earlier today, speaking of people being targeted as a result of just as a result of their commitment to the Constitution and the rule of law, obviously this administration is targeting lawyers and judges and anyone using the legal process. And earlier today, we won a court ruling for the American Bar Association that the Department of Justice has unconstitutionally targeted and actually retaliated against, canceled some of their grants, because the American Bar Association has said this simple thing, that all lawyers actually do have an obligation to the Constitution and to defend the rule of law. And so we see this, popping up everywhere, and people, whether they're federal employees, state employees, local employees, government employees, or lawyers, or in other professions across the country, I think really coming into that value set. But there's a lot of things that we can do to fight back, and I'll start by just saying that what we know and what research shows us, and what I think our own lived experiences from these past few weeks, it's only been 100 days or so, but from these past few weeks and months show us, is that what extreme political movements, in particular autocratic movements, what they want you to believe is that you are alone, and that you have no power, and that there is nothing that you can do. And so part of the strategy is to try to make people feel as if there's nothing that we can do. It's to try to make the lawyers feel like it doesn't matter if you go into court, because we're going to ignore that court order. It doesn't matter if you go to the Senate. We're going to call and try to threaten senators for listening to their very constituents. And what we know is that actually the power of people works, and it does move things, and it does change the world, but they want you to believe that it doesn't. And so I think the first thing we have to do to protect the civil servants and the people that have protected and worked for all of us as the American people is to know that we actually do have power in this moment to build something better and to oppose this, even when it feels like it doesn't. And any time you feel that there is this futility, you have to remember that that is actually their strategy, is to make you feel as if that there is nothing that you can do. The legal system is imperfect. It is not a silver bullet. It is not going to be able to solve every problem that is coming at the American people or our civil servants, but it is a powerful tool. And you see AFGE and so many organizations that have been willing and able to go into court every single day to secure court orders as they can to protect employees. We are in the USAID case, litigating that case. And so I think for those of you that are here, we need to encourage folks to use the legal rights and the legal tools they have, and you can learn more about that at democracyforward.org. But it's not just the courts, it's the people. And so it's time now for everyone to make a commitment. They're going to write, call, visit, if you can, if you're in the DC area, members of Congress and others who work for you. But making your voice heard and the mobilization and community building in this moment is so critical. And just refusing to feel alone and refusing to feel that your efforts are futile, because they are not, but they are seeking to try to make you feel that way.
If I may piggyback onto that, because I think this is a phenomenal, segue. I've had a couple members of Congress, ask, "Oh my gosh, fired federal workers, what can we do for you?" And I think, my message is simple, right? It's 3 words: investigate, imprison, rebuild. I'm serious. Like, we know there are illegal actions going on. Yes, thank you. Yeah. We know there are illegal actions going on. I'm asking for Democrats to investigate that. And listen, you can call me old-fashioned, but when somebody breaks the law, you should go to jail. We need to imprison them if they are breaking the law. And then 3, rebuild. We need to rebuild our federal government better and stronger so that the next Trump that comes through will not be able to destroy it. Investigate, imprison, rebuild.
Great. All right. Very good. Let me just say that I have to agree with a lot of what Skye has said here, because power is in us, right? Those of you that have listened to me over the last few months, you heard me talk a lot about the power of we, the people. Now, it looks dark occasionally when we look out and see what's happening in our world, in our country, in our nation that we love so much. Many of us have fought for. It looks dark. But we must continue to educate our communities, okay? Because this is, people have been given a false narrative, and it's up to us to really put the truth out there. And so that's what we've been doing across this nation. Not only do we have to continue to educate, but we have to continue to organize, organize our members, organize our communities, organize even our legislatures, okay? Because, believe it or not, I've even had Republican congressmen to tell me, I appreciate what you're doing, Everett, but they're afraid to step out there and really, let it be known. But so therefore, it's up to us. The power of we. We is about us. We. It's not about me and mine, right? And there's power in that, because when we have organized our membership, we have organized our communities, right? And then guess what? That become an effect that kind of is a rippling effect that says, you know what? We are now ready to take on this monster because we mobilizes the moment. We establishes organizations that do what we are here doing here tonight. It's we. Just remember this. The power is in us. The power is not in this administration. And if we continue to mobilize, we continue to organize, guess what? Eventually, we're going to overcome this monstrosity that we're dealing with here and now. In this moment, it's going to be in the past, and we're going to be on top once again. So let's continue to stay together. Let's continue to realize where our power really is, and let's move on that. So I just wanted to leave that with you. It's in us, the power of we. Everybody in here say that. It'll make you feel good. The power of we.
Of we.
Because that's where the power is. Say it, we.
We.
We. We have the power. Let's continue to strive for that. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Please welcome our next panel, Explosion at the DOJ. Randall Eliason, Eileen O'Connor, our moderator Matt Ford, and Quinta Jurecic.
Hello, everyone. Well, I am Matt Ford with the New Republic. I cover law, democracy, and the courts, and sitting at the intersection of all those three things is the Department of Justice. It's an important government institution in that it ensures, both through action and inaction, that we have a functioning democracy. And I'm really looking forward to talking with our panelists today about what exactly that entails. Randall, I'll start with you. You're a former federal prosecutor. You have a lot of experience with how these cases are normally handled, with the ethical expectations of people who serve at the Department of Justice. What stands out to you the most so far about how the new Attorney General, Pam Bondi, and the Trump administration in general has handled the shift at the Justice Department?
How much time do we have? More than any one particular case, I think the thing that's been so kind of, the word I always use is heartbreaking for those of us who work in the Justice Department and know about its mission and love it, is just the attempt that's going on to completely transform the culture and philosophy of the Justice Department. For generations, political parties come and go, and different administrations have different priorities and the different things they focus on, but at the Justice Department, cases always took place against the backdrop of certain kind of fundamental principles. That politics is kept out of prosecution, that criminal law and law enforcement aren't used to punish political enemies or to pursue political goals, that you pursue your cases without fear or favor. And cases would go on, from administration. As administration has changed, the cases would continue. And that's just been completely tossed out the window by the current administration that's openly using or seeking to use the Department of Justice to punish political enemies, to reward friends, to pursue cases for political ends, to fire and discipline prosecutors just for doing their jobs, to target law firms for representing cases or clients that the president doesn't like. And the damage that that's doing to the whole concept of the rule of law and the justice system in this country is, like I said, one of the most heartbreaking things that's going on, I think, in the Justice Department. And one of the things that concerns me is whether that damage, can be fixed, right? Whether the public faith in the justice system can be restored. because right now it's being terribly damaged by the current administration.
And part of your tenure involved specifically as an assistant U.S. attorney in the D.C. office. And that office has gained sort of outsized attention in recent weeks, shall we say, because of the actions of interim U.S. Attorney Ed Martin. He's been writing a lot of letters, been making a lot of statements. How do you characterize his approach to the job versus what the traditional expectation is?
Well, it's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. His primary qualification is as a political operative. He's had no prosecutorial experience and immediately began to demonstrate that he has no idea what the job involves or what his proper role is by taking steps to, among other things, discipline the January 6th prosecutors for pursuing righteous cases that resulted in 1,200 convictions by juries and judges all across the political spectrum here in D.C. Pursuing scientific journals, writing them threatening letters, writing letters to members of Congress about speeches that they made, just clearly acting in a political way, and then bragging about it on social media, which is not something you do if you're a prosecutor. You don't go on Twitter or X and start talking about your cases and making threats. So the Martin case is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Instead of focusing on the independence of the Justice Department, the importance of the job, and putting people in place who understand the obligations of criminal prosecutors and the importance of independence from the White House and not injecting politics into the job, the administration places someone whose primary qualification is as a political operative who's intensely loyal to the president and will try to use the power of that U.S. Attorney's Office to pursue a political agenda on Trump's behalf.
And you mentioned the January 6th cases. We know the Biden Justice Department had a lot of energy devoted to that. There were a lot of cases about that. Quinta, you covered that extensively. We're seeing a pullback from now. We're seeing reversal, and we're seeing that prosecutorial power used in more malign ways. I'm thinking of the Abrego Garcia case. I'm thinking of the recent arrest of a judge, I believe in Wisconsin, of the mayor of Newark. What are we seeing on the ground in terms of what the Trump administration is saying beyond words and rhetoric and actually trying to put into practice?
There's another example, actually, that came to light, I think, just in the hour or two before we sat down here, which is the criminal charges pressed in Massachusetts against Ksenia Petrova, whose name might be familiar. She is the Russian-born scientist at Harvard who has been in immigration detention for the last month or so after she was detained in Logan Airport, and her visa was stripped because she was bringing in frog embryos from France. There was a hearing in her case, a habeas action, just this morning. And then just this afternoon, the Justice Department unveiled a criminal charge against her for smuggling, again, the same frog embryos. I will confess I haven't looked at the charging documents. I don't think there's very much there, but it certainly looks on the surface like an example of the Justice Department sort of using the criminal code as a way to sort of further bring the power of the state against this person who may very well have done nothing wrong, as her lawyer argued this morning. And I think that is a really striking example of the willingness of the administration to, as Randall was saying, use the Justice Department as a political tool rather than as a source of the equal administration of justice. I do think one thing that is worth keeping in mind here is actually how few cases we have seen in terms of criminal prosecution. So immigration enforcement, of course, is a different and complicated issue. Mm-hmm. But in terms of potentially malicious instances of criminal prosecution or investigation, I will confess there have been fewer than I might have expected. And I think we sort of saw a tinge of that actually in something that Ed Martin, now ensconced at Main Justice, said the other day, where he indicated that his role in the weaponization committee, trying to undo supposedly weaponization by the Biden administration, that he was going to be doing a lot of naming and shaming. That is striking because that is also, as Randall was saying, not something that you typically see coming from the Justice Department. Typically, the idea is that you don't want to get out over your skis before charges are announced. But I think it's telling that Martin, in some ways, I think you could read his statements as tacitly acknowledging we may not be able to actually bring criminal cases here against those individuals who we are claiming, have done great wrongs in weaponizing the Justice Department in the past. That this is actually something where the safeguards that do exist in the system, in terms of the unwillingness of line prosecutors to take those steps, the unwillingness of grand juries to indict, the unwillingness of judges to move forward on these cases, might actually serve as a significant protection here, and that you might instead see more of what Martin seemed to enjoy doing during his time as interim U.S. Attorney in D.C., sending a lot of nasty letters, putting a lot of stuff out there on social media. And so, to be clear, that is deeply concerning, and I think it raises serious questions about the integrity of the department and about the dangers that actions like that do bring about. But I think because of that, it's worth kind of expanding our conception of what a Department of Justice in the wrong hands might do beyond just a criminal investigation or prosecution.
In terms of the performative aspect of that, do you think that's something that is there going to be their default? Or do you think it's just a matter of them building up energy, getting people in place, sort of laying groundwork for future cases? Or is this something where they're going to huff, they're going to puff, and nothing's actually going to blow down in that front?
It's hard to say, right? And I think one of the lessons we learned in these first 100 days or so is never say never. But it is very noteworthy to me that a lot of the actions that the administration has taken really to attack its political enemies so far has been, yes, to some extent through the Justice Department, but most of it has been through executive orders or through actions outside criminal enforcement. Now, that doesn't mean that, you couldn't attempt to launch a retaliatory investigation. That's absolutely something that could happen and is very concerning. But I do wonder what we might be seeing is, certainly there have been really concerning developments undermining the sort of spirit and ethos of the Department of Justice. If you want to find the silver lining, I do wonder if we will see more resilience than we might have expected. That said, of course, there's a very, very long way to go, and I don't want to make too many predictions.
There's a flip side too, right? I mean, in addition to using the Justice Department to punish enemies, there's also inappropriately using the Justice Department to reward your friends and reward your political allies.
Which is a great deal easier to do.
We have seen a lot of that, and it's much easier to do, right? It's hard to bring a criminal case and to get a conviction. But the pardons of the January 6th rioters, the dropping of the Eric Adams case, the many other ways in which this administration is using the Justice Department to reward political reward political friends is equally concerning as the use of the justice system to punish enemies.
And when I think of sort of that governing almost by inaction, one area I think of is the Civil Rights Division, where we've seen a lot of turmoil there in recent weeks. Eileen, when you worked there for a long time, what's your sense of the changes that are there and how they've come about?
The changes are massive and unprecedented. It's hard to overstate just how big a change has happened since the second Trump administration began. In keeping with what both of you have referred to, with a change of how this administration sees the Department of Justice as its tool, its own weapon. I believe the day after Pam Bondi was confirmed as Attorney General, she issued a memo in which she referred to DOJ attorneys as the president's lawyers. And that just turns on its head the way the Department of Justice is supposed to function. When attorneys from the Department of Justice appear in court, they say, "My name is Jane Doe. I'm here on behalf of the United States." They don't say, "I'm here on behalf of President Trump, President Biden, President Obama." And so that I think, in my mind, and I'm not at the Civil Rights Division anymore, I left last summer, but that, in my mind, was the beginning of pushing out what has now, the most recent report I saw was 70% of the staff in the Civil Rights Division has left or will be gone by probably the end of May. Because that happened in February, and then slowly, nobody in the Civil Rights Division, so far as I know, was fired, in contrast to the January 6th prosecutors. But they pushed out, or they moved to different parts of the Department of Justice, or sometimes different parts of the federal government entirely, a significant number of the managers in the Civil Rights Division. And then they issued these mission statements, and a lot of you probably read about those. And again, the mission statements, they weren't made public, but you could find bits and pieces of them reported on, just sort of, again, turned on their head what the Civil Rights Division, the work that it has done, for decades, since 1957 when it was founded. In particular, I worked in the voting section. This mission statement for the voting section was all about investigating voter fraud, which is something that a different part of the Department of Justice is tasked with, but never the Civil Rights Division. It talked about enforcing this executive order, part of which has already been enjoined by a federal court for being illegal, and which people who do voting rights, most of them probably think, on its face was illegal to begin with. So they were supposed to be doing voter fraud investigations, enforcing this illegal executive order. They were supposed to be probably getting information from databases that they didn't have any business getting. And that was just in the voting section. No mention of the Voting Rights Act, which was a core function, enforcing that, of the voting section. And similarly in housing and civil enforcement, no mention of the Fair Housing Act. So all of these mission statements that just turned on their head the work that these career civil servants had done for decades in the Civil Rights Division. And that all happened within days before the second DRIP, the Deferred Resignation Program, the second fork, maybe some people know it that way, before that deadline. And so that was how they did it. They never, no firings, but just piece after piece, giving everybody in the Civil Rights Division the message that you're not only are you not going to be enforcing the statutes that you have been tasked with enforcing, but you're probably going to be asked to do things that violate, for attorneys, the oaths you took as an attorney and your duty of candor to the court.
And what does that look like on the ground? Because, we're used to perceiving the Justice Department as filing cases, doing things. What does that in action entail in terms of risk, especially on the voting rights front? We have a midterm election coming up next year. Obviously, we have a presidential election not far after that. How is that going to change the landscape for how all the legal battles that now crop up after every election or during every election, what's the state of play going to be with the Justice Department taking a different approach here?
In the voting space, one of the examples that comes to mind is the Department of Justice, the Civil Rights Division sends out election monitors every election. And in presidential elections, it is hundreds and hundreds of people who are going out to polling places across the country just to observe and take notes and ensure that the federal statutes that protect the right to vote are being followed. And so a lot of that just looks like, watching out for intimidation, watching out for poll worker or, adequate bilingual materials where it's required. So that is a giant, that program relies on the staff of the Civil Rights Division, and with no Civil Rights Division, that protection will not be there, on election day itself and in the days leading up to election. There are obviously loads of cases to enforce the Voting Rights Act that won't be brought. There are also, there are things that the Civil Rights Division, that only the Civil Rights Division can do. There are certain statutes that protect the right to vote. There are other statutes that only the Civil Rights Division is able to enforce. With policing, some of that work, only the Civil Rights Division is able to do. So there's just going to be a void, and there will be certain private, institutions that can fill in some of that, but some of it we'll just be turning back the clock. We'll just be giving up these protections that, we have these statutes, but they just won't be enforced because there won't be anyone doing it.
I know that each president comes in with their own certain set of priorities, things that they want to focus on maybe a little more in a world of limited resources, that means focusing on other things less. There have been reports recently that the department is really drawing down on white-collar crime prosecutions. And Randall, I know that's a specialty of yours. What are the implications of that for everyday Americans?
Well, if there's less enforcement, then there's less deterrence, and presumably that results in more corruption. I mean, it's sort of a, and you're right, every administration comes in with its own priorities, but the trouble with de-emphasizing public corruption prosecutions is that then it allows it to flourish, and that all sort of ties in with a lot of the allegations of corruption involving this administration. It sort of makes sense that they would treat that as less of a priority, and they want to focus elsewhere. But yeah, it's that lack of emphasis or lack of priority combined with the, Supreme Court decisions in the last couple of decades that have made prosecuting corruption cases so difficult to begin with is going to lead. Those cases have already been on the decline, and it's clearly only going to get worse now because the Justice Department doesn't appear to be interested in focusing on those types of cases, which leaves the path to corruption much more open.
And, when I think of corruption, I think of the executive orders that have been coming out against the law firms. Paul Weiss was the first one to really accept them, but the sort of chilling effect it's having on the legal profession as a whole in taking up amicus cases. Quinta, what's your sense of how that's shaping? We know from the first Trump administration there were a lot of lawyers that stepped up, a lot of law firms that stepped up. Is that going to be what we see this time?
It's a great question, and I think it's very much still coming into focus. Obviously, we've had a flood of litigation so far against the administration, but I think the effects of those executive orders are really still being felt out, in part because the firms that chose to fight are, many of them, all of them received temporary restraining orders in their favor. They're now going for permanent orders blocking enforcement. And the firms that chose not to fight, I think, are only now realizing what bad deals they received. I will say that I actually had a really interesting conversation, which we ran in the Lawfare Daily, our podcast, with two partners from Kecker, Van Nest, and Peters, who had published an op-ed in the New York Times urging firms to fight. And one of the things that they told me on the record was that they had been getting calls from partners at the firms that had chosen not to fight, essentially saying, will you take on these pro bono cases for us? We do not feel like we can take on these immigration cases, environmental litigation, litigation on any area that, something that could be flagged as DEI, that is just not something that they feel able to do. And so it's being, in their telling, pushed to other firms. And so the question then is, well, to what extent can those other firms pick up that burden? There's a lot of litigation out there. And I know there's been reporting about people having difficulty finding pro bono representation precisely because of this problem. So while it is very heartening to see the firms that chose to fight win in court, I am certainly worried that, especially as things drag on, that we will start to see this effect display in the courts.
Looking ahead in terms of what people can do and what we should expect, obviously the next 4 years, it's hard to predict, but I'd like to start with Eileen and then hear everybody's answers on this. Imagine that a Democratic president is elected in 2028. They're setting out to put a new attorney general in. They're looking at what to do with the department in sort of this post-Trump era. Eileen, what should Democrats and the opposition and a next hypothetical president do to rectify the situation we find ourselves in?
Well, whether the next president is a Democrat or Republican, they should rebuild the Department of Justice and just return to the, we keep talking about these principles and norms that are in place. After Watergate, a lot of those, came into place, and they have been tested, but they've never been just demolished in the way that this administration is attempting to do so. So I think one of the questions is actually not what should happen when a new administration comes in that is committed to the rule of law and committed to enforcing the civil rights statutes and all of the other statutes that the Department of Justice is tasked with enforcing, but also what has to happen before that. And so right now, people have to be planning for how do we rebuild, how do we get back into place a functioning Department of Justice. And a lot of that means like there's this huge brain drain, from the Civil Rights Division and from elsewhere as well. And so figuring out how people can continue doing that work so that the expertise is still there, so that we can rebuild and probably put in some additional guardrails, though those are tricky to say what exactly those should be, but so that somebody can't come in and just blow it all up.
I think the issue of what those guardrails should be is so tricky and so important, and
so I don't have anything to say about that.
And so what I would say, is our hypothetical next president, whatever party they happen to belong to, would, in a perfect world, ideally be willing to give up some measure of presidential power and work with Congress to actually push forward legislation that would help restrain a malicious future president. This was a problem that we saw under the Biden administration. There were a lot of different legislative proposals that were put forward that would have created some level of bulwark to protect the Justice Department. Now, they're limited by the direction that the Supreme Court's jurisprudence has gone on presidential power, but there were proposals out there, and one of the reasons they never moved forward was because whatever party happens to be in control of the White House tends to want to use presidential power to its benefit. And so the White House and the Justice Department were unwilling to sort of countenance a rollback of presidential authority, and as a result, Democrats in Congress sort of didn't want to go out on a limb without the support of the White House, and Republicans were not interested for other reasons. And so it was sort of this perfect storm where it was just not at the top of anyone's priority list. For good reasons, to be fair. I'm giving you the most negative take, but there were good reasons that it wasn't prioritized, and yet that's a big part of why we are where we are today. And so what I would say is we need to be willing to start thinking more creatively about what it would mean to protect the Department of Justice and rebuild that integrity and protect it from future attack. And also there needs to be a willingness to actually identify that as a priority and move forward with it as a priority in Congress.
Yep. I agree with all of that. The only thing that I'd add is just to emphasize and sort of tying back into the prior panel, the people within the Justice Department, the career people who work there and take on that mission, and to them these values of the independence of the Justice Department, the importance of the rule of law, keeping politics out of prosecutions, these are not just platitudes. This becomes part of their DNA. They really deeply, deeply believe this stuff. It's part of their professional identity, and that's why you see people resigning in protest, like we saw with the Eric Adams prosecutors in the Civil Rights Division, when they're being asked to do things they just can't in good conscience do. But those people that so fundamentally and deeply believe in that mission are still going to be out there. And so I think part of the rebuilding is going to be being able to get those people back and to instill that mindset back in a new generation of Justice Department attorneys who will go back and live that mission. But what's going on right now is so heartbreaking just because it is such a fundamental part of the department and of the professional identity of the people that work there, and we need to find a way to encourage those people to come back and to instill that mindset once again.
Well, I want to thank all our panelists for talking today. This has been very informative and helpful, and certainly a topic that we're going to have to keep a close eye on, given the importance of the department in maintaining our democracy to ensure that it reflects the democratic values that we live by. Thank you guys so much.
For our next panel, Immigration on the Run, please welcome Veronica Escobar, Andrea Flores, Aaron Melnick, and our moderator, Greg Sargent.
Hello. All right, we're going to dive right into this because everybody's tight on time. So, one second. I'm going to introduce each of them as the questions are asked, rather than at the top. So everybody knows we're in the middle of a major crisis on this issue. Millions of people are at risk of deportation. Huge amounts of federal resources are being diverted to deportations away from other law enforcement functions, foreign students getting kidnapped, many migrants getting renditioned abroad. But I want to try to get into the deeper project that Trump and Stephen Miller are trying to pull off here, which I think is larger than the sum of its parts. So we're going to get into it. I'm going to start with Congresswoman Veronica Escobar. She's in her fourth term representing her hometown of El Paso, Texas, serves on the House Appropriations and Budget Committees, and has been very active on this issue, introducing a bipartisan comprehensive immigration reform in the last Congress. Congresswoman, can you give us just a brief overview of how bad things are for immigrants in this country right now, preferably what you're hearing directly from them on a regular basis?
Well, first, thank you so much for hosting this panel, and it's a privilege to be on stage with such amazing thinkers and leaders, and thanks to all of you for being here to hear us out. Things are really horrible, and I don't even have the words to explain how bad things are. And the immigrant community is obviously feeling a tremendous amount of fear. People feel terrorized. I hear from my school districts that their enrollment is down because kids are afraid to go to school. I'm hearing from all sorts of small businesses that business is down because people are afraid to be out. It could not be more terrifying for the immigrant community. But as you mentioned, Greg, kind of in the larger context, what is happening overall is we are seeing a real backsliding of our democracy, and we're seeing the rise of authoritarianism, and so vulnerable people get crushed in this context. And we see at the same time Republicans, even those who are not thrilled with what the president is doing and who recognize the impact on their communities, there is a real lack of courage on their part to stand up for their communities. And they don't have to be pro-immigration. They just have to be pro-democracy and for due process. But they're pretty afraid as well for different reasons.
Do you hear from Republican colleagues who privately tell you what they think of what's going on in their communities? I have. And with the canceling of TPS, for example, for Venezuelans, you can only imagine in a state like Florida what this means to Venezuelan communities. But there are Republicans who I think are freaked out, but not freaked out enough to have the spine to publicly call out their president. Thanks, Congresswoman. We're going to go to Aaron Reichlin-Melnick, Senior Fellow at the American Immigration Council. Very active social media presence. I advise you all to follow him closely on Twitter and Blue Skye, I guess more. He informs us all about this issue in a way that few others do, and repeatedly testifies before Congress. Has done that a number of times now, maybe a dozen?
7 times.
7 times. So, Aaron, can you just walk us through the specific initiatives that Trump has undertaken, maybe ones that are less familiar to people, like the efforts to cancel temporary protected status, suspension of refugee resettlement, the firings of immigration judges, that type of thing? What's going on in the nitty-gritty of this here?
Yeah, well, of course, before I get started, again, thank you to the New Republic, and I'm really grateful to everyone in the audience. So in the easy task of explaining everything that's happened in immigration in 3 minutes, so I really quickly want to break down this in between what's happened at the border, what's happening in the interior, and what's happening with our legal immigration system. At the border, asylum is effectively dead. The Biden administration left office with a carrot and stick policy in place where migrants were funneled to the ports of entry, to these alternate legal pathways so they could come in there. Those legal pathways have been shut off. As of today, thanks to an invasion executive order signed by President Trump, migrants are being completely turned away and cannot go to a port of entry to seek asylum. And that has caused people to stop going north for now. We're only 3 months in. Who knows what's going to come in the future, but for now, the border is quiet. In the legal immigration system, the changes have really just started. The biggest shift has been the implementation of explicit ideological screening, new social media screening for people coming into the country and applying for legal immigration benefits, and a planned travel ban, which could potentially block as many as 1 in 5 legal immigrants from coming to the United States. That has not yet been implemented, but we know it is coming any day now. We are also seeing more extreme vetting of immigrants, and we're going to lead also to a reduction in force at U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. So everything about the process will be shrouded in red tape and slowed down. They are also kicking people off of temporary legal statuses that they are here already on. There are roughly 2 million people in the United States who have some form of what's been deemed twilight status, temporary protected status, DACA, deferred action for childhood arrivals, or humanitarian parole. The Trump administration, in its first term, tried to strip DACA, and they are likely going to try to do that again. And they have already moved to terminate DACA for upwards of 850,000 people. When temporary protected status is stripped, if they succeed in this, it's currently being blocked in the court. That means that every person from that country with the status would lose their ability to be here legally and to work legally on a single day. Had they gotten their way and not been blocked in court on April 7th, 350,000 people would have lost their legal status on a single day. But beyond that, it is also what they're doing on the interior with enforcement. And there is the climate of fear that Congresswoman Escobar talked about. We are seeing this administration use every hidden weapon of immigration law, every law that's on the books that's been sitting there all the way back to 1798 in the Alien Enemies Act to carry out their so-called mass deportation campaign. And the thing is, they are not actually hitting the numbers they want to hit with this mass deportation campaign. So what they are doing is creating this climate where immigrants are faced with a variety of options, all of them bad. They've implemented something known as registration, telling around 2 to 3 million undocumented immigrants who are not on the radar of the U.S. government already, that if they don't come forward and be fingerprinted and give their names and addresses to ICE, then they can be criminally charged for failure to register. They have also implemented this Alien Enemies Act proclamation, sent people to El Salvador, and they are pulling law enforcement from every other part of the federal government, the FBI, the DEA, the IRS, the U.S. Postal Service, Inspector Police, to carry out immigration enforcement in communities around the country. A new order from President Trump says they need to bring 20,000 new people on board this enforcement operation. Taken together, what this means is that we are seeing a huge increase in internal enforcement, and it is more visible than ever. But the fundamental resource bottlenecks in the system still prevent them from hitting 1 million deportations a year. So for now, they are pressuring people with this climate of fear to self-deport. And that is the message you're going to see coming out of this administration. If you don't want to be one of those videos, if you don't want your family member to be one of those videos, if you want to be safe, leave now, because they know they don't have the resources to do it on their own, and they want people to do it for free, essentially.
Aaron, I just want to pick up on one thing about that. I think it might be worth clarifying for people that the due process that migrants get right now, it actually is an impediment to their deportation fantasies, right?
Yeah, because due process has a meaning here. So what does due process mean? Due process at its core is 2 things. It's notice and it's an opportunity to be heard. And for people in the United States, it's immigration court. And in immigration court, there's 2 steps to it. Step 1, can a person legally be deported? And step 2, is there something that person can apply for that lets them stay? And for millions of people, the answer is yes. There's applications they can file. They can file for asylum, cancellation of removal, U visas, T visas, a lot of other options that exist in the immigration law that let people stay. But the Trump administration doesn't like that. They want to get around the immigration courts, which is why they're doing things like pressuring people to self-deport or the Alien Enemies Act, because all of those don't have due process. All of those either skip judges, skip any sort of adversarial testing, or people do their own work for them.
Right, and so when Stephen Miller talks about doing away with due process or Trump tweets some crazy rant about doing away with hearings. There's a reason for it. It's that it's a genuine obstacle to their plans. I want to move on to Andrea Flores. Andrea has served as an immigration advisor in the DHS and in other executive agencies, and also in the Senate as well. She's vice president of immigration policy at Forward.us, which is a bipartisan group advocating for reform. Andrea, it seems to me that the deeper project here that Trump and Miller are trying to do is kind of acclimate the American people to a number of things that maybe feel a little, extreme, but they want to sort of boiled frog style get people to accept it, right? The extensive use of state propaganda to demonize migrants, the treatment of them as an alien enemy within, subject to new levels of force, including renditions to foreign prisons, wholesale suspension of due process for migrants, and critically, the creation of a vast, unreviewable presidential removal power that's wholly unaccountable to any courts. Can you talk about what this broader project is and what it really adds up to?
Absolutely, and thank you as well for having me, and thank you to the New Republic. The frog is boiling, right? The Constitution is being tested in multiple ways. You have students being arrested in an attempt to deport them for violation of free speech, right? What does the First Amendment mean if international students can't write an op-ed? You have the Fifth Amendment being tested, right? Due process is being suspended for a group of Venezuelan men who are still stranded in a detention center, and we're paying for it. You have the 14th Amendment being challenged tomorrow in the Supreme Court, equal protection, the right to birthright citizenship for the children of immigrants who are born in the United States. They are systematically going through every constitutional right of which immigrants are protected under the Constitution, and they are seeing how far they can get in litigation in weakening those rights, not just for immigrants, but for all of us, because if the First Amendment all of a sudden has a number of exceptions, that can be applied to Americans. And if due process is not allowed for immigrants, then, and I can say this as someone who grew up in a border community, and the first time I had a mistake in immigration enforcement, I grew up near El Paso, I was 12 years old. There are already mistakes happening far before Trump took office in the immigration system. So if you don't have due process, how on earth is a U.S. citizen going to challenge their improper arrest, detention, and deportation? And I want to go to the question you asked Aaron about, are they trying to get around, is deportation like a problem? What is the goal of deportation? And I think we really have to talk about the politics of this moment, because the frog is boiling because there isn't enough opposition to all of the things that Aaron laid out. They're happening fast, they're detailed, they're sometimes hard to understand, and we don't have a robust opposition helping the public realize just how much it's impacting their communities as well, right? Like, so registry, a failure to registry is criminalizing a whole new group of people, that you'll have a whole new group of families whose relatives now are going to be subject to arrest, incarceration, United States, and deportation, right? It's broad sweeping, and I think both parties sometimes treat immigrants as though they sort of like happen or are external to our communities. They are interwoven in our communities and are related to millions of American citizens. So they are succeeding. Yeah. They're succeeding, and they're weakening the Constitution, and I really hope, and I want to highlight something that I think was really important. When you saw Senator Chris Van Hollen pick a really strong fight on El Salvador, and he went by himself, and he went with the press he could get to pay attention, and he said, I want to bring back this man who the Department of Homeland Security and Department of Justice have acknowledged is wrongfully deported. There is a process. The government wrongfully deports people in every administration. And he made a case. And what did you see? You saw the public all of a sudden turn against Trump administration immigration policy. But we were just talking in the green room about how when there's less narrating of what is happening, Trump's approval on immigration goes up. So I just want to sort of, remind the audience that it is going to get as bad as we let it, and it's going to be as bad as sort of the silence sort of permits.
Yeah, I think I do want to underscore what Andrea just said there, which is that when the public was told what's actually happening with Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who's the man who was wrongfully deported from Maryland to an El Salvadoran prison, when that story was told to people through a dramatic gesture by a Democrat who really stuck his neck out in a major way, and quite literally, because he was picked up, or at least stopped by a bunch of heavily armed police, and with, I believe, Chris Newman, right? And when that happened, Trump's disapproval on immigration went up, not just on the specifics, but also generally. And so, anyway, do you want to address that? It seems like something you feel strongly about. I do too. Storytelling is essential right now, isn't it?
It is, and I think there's a lot of people misreading the results of the last election and thinking that immigration itself is always unpopular with the public, and that's just simply not true. We just don't have people raising up the issues that remain popular. It's, protecting dreamers, fighting for paths to citizenship, fighting for bills like Representative Escobar's that provide paths to citizenship, that protect dreamers, farm workers, provide order to the system. And those are real proposals, but we have too few leaders talking about them, and there are solutions. But as long as we allow Trump, President Trump is on year 10 of executing a very specific, clear, consistent anti-immigrant agenda. And so there has to be an opposite story told.
I just want to remind people, because this is a forgotten fact, but during his first term, he was actually unpopular on this issue. You wouldn't know that listening to some of the punditry, though. Which brings me to the Congresswoman. There's been a lot of debate over how Democrats should be responding right now, and frankly seems underwhelming a lot of the time, present company accepted. A lot of them voted for the Lake and Riley Act, which badly cripples due process. You opposed that very strongly. Not all Dems have stood up for Abrego Garcia. So this is the question I have for you, Congresswoman. It seems to me that many Democrats have decided that this debate simply can't be won with Trump. Do you think that's the view of some of your colleagues? And what options do they have here that maybe they're not availing themselves of? And what would you like to see them do more of?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will tell you the disappointment, my disappointment with my party on this issue goes, beyond this current administration. From the minute that I got into Congress, part of why I ran for Congress, I ran in 2018, was because I felt my community was under attack by Donald Trump. I felt immigrants were under attack by Donald Trump, and it was a very threatening time as well. Looking back on it, it's incredible just how much worse this era is, how much worse Trump 2.0 is. But even in those early days, I remember speaking up in caucus and telling my colleagues we should be leaning in on immigration, and we should be the ones pushing the ideas and the solutions. And we can do this in a bipartisan way. There are still some Republicans willing to actually address the issue and reform the system, but there were a lot of colleagues of mine who still feel this way, that it is not a winning issue, and that it is in fact a losing issue. And our lack of leadership over time essentially creates a vacuum that will be filled by Republicans. Now, having said that, I will also say every time there's been bipartisan compromise that looks like it's about to pass in the last decade, there's been one party that has sabotaged the efforts around reform, and that's been the Republican Party. So it really is we think the immigration system is broken, the political system is broken. But I also want to say at the same time, what I was frustrated with in the last administration and in the last Congress, and I represent a community where at one point we were seeing 10,000 people arriving at our nation's front door over the course of a couple of days. Like every couple of days, the numbers were, 5,000 a day, 10,000 in 2 days. Unsustainable numbers. But we also had folks in my party who were very, very critical of the Biden administration when the Biden administration was trying to create some semblance of order. And so, we've got a big tent. The Democratic Party is a big tent. We've got conservative Dems, we've got moderate Dems, we've got, progressive Dems, and we've got far left Dems, right? So it is very challenging to find consensus within the party. And I had long-time immigrant families in my border community deeply disappointed with the Democratic Party during that period of high migration because they felt, my family's been waiting in line for 20 years. They've never gotten a work permit. Why are recent arrivals getting a work permit? So it's a complicated issue, even in immigrant communities, even in border communities, even in immigrant families.
I wonder if part of the problem for Democrats is that precisely that moderates don't think it's a winning issue, so we don't hear from them that often, whereas you do hear from the left wing of the party. And so that might create a bit of a skewed picture of what the big tent actually represents on the issue. Do you think that's a problem?
I think it is. And I will tell you, every one of my moderate colleagues wants a solution. But I think we have to do a better job as a party of talking about the fact that we can have a secure border and we can have a fair, humane, and just immigration system. It's not impossible. And Andrea mentioned the bipartisan bill that I worked on with a Republican colleague, and it presented some very common sense solutions that if only we had passed it last Congress, we wouldn't be in the place that we're in right now.
Well, President Biden did something similar to what your plan envisions, which is basically a combination of more border security, some restrictions on asylum, which do seem necessary at this point. But on top of that, broadening legal pathways for people to come in through other channels, and he wouldn't even really defend it. So that's a problem, too.
Yes, agreed. And again, if we lean in, ultimately what the American people want is legislators who will solve what they see as problems. And by shying away from the conversation and by shying away from leading on an issue that is a pressing issue for a lot of Americans, then we give the impression that we're unwilling to solve it.
Aaron, I was going to ask you a more involved question, but we're running down on time here. So can you just give us a really brief overview of what's going on in the courts, and maybe not even go through it blow by blow, but just say, what are the prospects for the courts really limiting the damage here? Is that something we can hope for or not?
Yeah, the courts are going to continue to play a very important role in this administration, and we've already seen them come in to stop some of the worst things that Trump was going to do. I mentioned at the beginning, temporary protected status. Had the courts not stepped in on April 7th, 350,000 people would have lost their status. That case is currently pending at the Supreme Court. We don't know whether they're going to step in. But that is a good sign of that the Trump administration isn't winning. In fact, they're losing a lot. And they're losing a lot because they're stretching the law and they're bulldozing the normal procedures of good governance that would be going into these various kinds of immigration measures. Whether it is stripping humanitarian parole, stripping TPS, or arresting people for their speech. Today, Badr Khan Suri, a Virginia man thrown into a detention center because of allegations of pro-Palestinian advocacy, was released from jail in Texas because a federal judge ruled that his detention violated the Constitution. But immigration law is systematically biased against immigrants, and it has been that way for many years. And that is why Congress has to act. The last time Congress made any major changes to our legal immigration system was November 1990, 1 month before the World Wide Web went online. The last time we made any changes to our asylum and enforcement system was 1996. So that gives you some sense. We are using 20th century laws to deal with 21st century problems and concerns, and the system is not flexible enough to handle it. And we have all these things like the Alien Enemies Act, registration, and everything sitting around on the books that has been in the case either centuries or decades or generations from earlier eras that are still now being resurrected by the Trump administration. So the courts can stop some of this, but at the end of the day, it is going to have to be Congress because the courts can only do so much.
Andrea, we're almost out of time, but I wanted to give you the last word on this. On the broader project here, it seems like what Trump and Miller really think is that there's a latent majority out there for ethno-nationalism, and a latent majority that can be persuaded that only unchecked presidential rendition powers can secure public safety. Are they succeeding at that or not?
Right now they're succeeding because there's no pushback on any public safety narratives. So there's no one calling out that mass deportations, there's no evidence that will make us safer in any way. There's no pushback that, arresting and body slamming a young woman in Massachusetts has absolutely no impact on any of our lives, right? There's no one calling out and holding accountable some of the tactics that they're using. Also, you see what happened in a country like Hungary, right? What they're doing is not new, it's not original, and it is the sort of playbook of authoritarians and other democracies that have backslid. And what happened is citizens thought that it wouldn't apply to them. They saw immigrants targeted first. Then once immigrants were targeted, Hungarian citizens who supported, worked with immigrants, served them in organizations like my own and Aaron's. They go after civil society. People think, oh, well, it's because they're doing immigration work, and they go from there. So they could succeed, right? And I think they have successfully ignored at least two federal district court and Supreme Court. They haven't brought Mr. Abrego Garcia back. They have not provided. We look at what happened in the federal district court with Judge Boasberg, right? I worked in the Department of Homeland Security. You can turn planes around. You can have a manifest with names. You can provide those names to families. You can ensure that someone who is in the custody, if you're paying a contractor, can call their families. They are not doing any of that. That is highly unusual. And you do not see enough former Democratic officials who've worked in national security calling any of that out. That is complacency, and that is a type of thing that will allow them to expand these tactics. They were about to send a plane to Libya. If they succeed, as they are currently succeeding with El Salvador, there's nothing stopping for mass disappearances of all types of family units, adults, and I think it's just really important that there is a narrative from also Congress on the public safety piece. It's not true. They're being dishonest, and you have to call them out for that.
I think the bottom line here is that we need Democrats and ordinary citizens to make a lot more noise about this issue. And the media.
And the media.
All right. Thank you so much to our panelists.
Hello there, me again, here to announce that we're departing a bit from the script because our next speaker, our closing keynote speaker, well, your work day may be done, but hers is not. She has to get back to the Senate to vote in about 20 minutes or so, so we wanted to make sure that we could hear from her, and then we'll follow her speech with the final panel on how we resist this. So, with very little further ado, but just a little ado, I want to introduce the senior senator from the state of Minnesota, first elected in 2006. She's the third ranking Democrat in the Senate, chairing the Steering and Policy Committee. She's the ranking member on the Agriculture Committee, also on the Judiciary Committee and the Commerce Committee, I believe, if I have those correct. She did something very interesting in 2019 and 2020 that you may recall and that she may do again in 2027 and 2028. We'll see about that. She's also the author, and this is really interesting to me, of a really terrific book. Like politicians write books, and sometimes they're not really books. Hers is a real book. It's a great book. It's called Antitrust. I commend it to you very highly, and we're very pleased to have with us here tonight Senator Amy Klobuchar.
Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you all for caring so much about our democracy, that you are here. I have to go back for votes. I got my role in the democracy, too. So I appreciated that they moved me up a little. But it's just wonderful to be here with the New Republic and all these great writers. And my friend Carol Butler, who I guess she just told me is the oldest bride in the history of America. That's not true. She's going to get married to win. After 25 years, there you go. Tonight, I just heard the tail end of this panel, which was incredible. You've literally heard, was Skye Perryman here too? Was she here, the lawyer? Huh? Good. I saw she was on the agenda. Sometimes, you know, she has to go to court. I actually had her speak at our retreat that we had. Yes, we had a Democratic Senate retreat. And she did a great job. And you've heard from people that are on the proverbial line of fire. And I was interested in hearing what this panel was saying about the courts. Because I think that is what is really the stress test of our democracy right now, until our Republican colleagues just decide to stop rubber stamping Donald Trump and stand up. The courts couldn't be. Yeah, thank you, one person who thinks they should. But I want to thank Michael for inviting me, and I'm glad we're getting together to talk about this path forward. And I think the first thing that you, like me, start out with all this was just the acknowledgement of how hard this has been on everyone that cares about our world. People who work at USAID that literally had to stand outside the building and watch the words of their life work being taken off that building. People who have devoted themselves to Veterans Affairs or rural America that feel like their dream has been stopped, and then most importantly, the people they serve, and what we're seeing with hunger around the world and so many other things. And the blast radius, when Donald Trump does a social media post on late Friday night or an announcement on Saturday morning, it's just not limited to Washington, D.C. And I think about that all the time. So when this all first started, right after the inauguration, which I had taken on the chairmanship of a year before. We knew who would win. That's a whole other story I'll get to in a moment. But the week after that, I found myself in the Container Store in suburban Minneapolis. And I had suddenly decided on a Saturday morning that I had to organize all the teas and coffees and the decaf teas. And I found myself, and I was in line in like a Marie Kondo moment with these boxes and things, with this shopping cart. And this total stranger comes up and says, "Amy Klobuchar, I know why you're here." And I said, you know, it's just Saturday morning. I'm going to be doing something this afternoon. I'm going to a robotics competition. She goes, no, I know why you're here. You're here because your life and our world is so out of control. And the only way you think you can control it is by organizing things from the Container Store. Totally true. Diagnosis complete. And so then I went back 2 weekends later, and by the time I got to the refrigerator, I'm like, that's it. Okay, so I then decided, okay, that's enough of that. I'm going to get to work. And I think that adjustment to what we had to do was kind of an adjustment our whole party went through. Duh, you all saw it happen. As well as the people who care a lot about this world. And it actually took me back when I sort of soul-searched on how to deal with this to the 2016 election. We all remember that election night. Everyone thought, remember, Hillary Clinton was going to be the first president. And I'm going around Minnesota to all these events. And at about 1 in the morning, I get a text from my daughter. She was in college at the time. And that she was there, and I had totally forgotten about this because the whole night was going so bad. And I forgot she was at the party in Brooklyn with her roommate, and she's in college, and she sends me this text, and it says, "Mom, what should we do now?" And I send this mom text back, and it goes, "It's getting very late. This isn't going well. The subway is still running. I just checked. You need to go back. You have a place to stay, and you have class tomorrow." That's what I wrote. And she wrote back, "Mom, I mean our country." And so I think that's the question that we have all been asking ourselves these last few months, which is, Mom, what should we do now? And so in my speech here, I'm going to try to answer that question. So tomorrow we hit 115 days of this Trump presidency. As I have shared with our caucus many times, if we're going to win this, we have to focus on what matters to people out there while we're saving our democracy. And what matters to them right now, I remember the first day I put these slides up with the word chaos. Chaos is up, corruption is up, and costs are up. Just ask anyone trying to buy a baby stroller. And as bad as it all gets, the important thing, and I'm sure you've been inspired by these panels today, is not to get cynical and not to wallow in this "we suck" movement. I am not a fan of that. I think that we have a very difficult situation in Congress. That's a Minnesota euphemism. But when we wallow in all that time spent doom texting or yelling at cable shows, spoiler alert, they can't hear you. These guys are off cutting cancer research for kids and veterans. They're coming after health care, and as I know from the Agriculture Committee, food assistance. They're igniting a trade war because I guess he can, that's sticking families and small businesses with thousands of dollars in tariff taxes, important to call it that, $4,000 per family. And the result is our economy shrank after growing last year, and it shrank in the first quarter. One of our jobs is to make sure that everybody in this country understands what's happened and who's to blame. The American people, I think you've seen these numbers and these polls, they actually do get it. This president, after 100 days, had the lowest polling numbers of every president since polling began in their 100 days. Only 37% of the country, which is basically his base, thinks that he's handling the economy well. So for anyone that says, you guys suck, you haven't focused on things, we actually have focused repeatedly in the best sort of mind-numbing way we can on the economic message. And I figure our job is to stand our ground and to make very clear what he is doing and to do everything we can to stand up for democracy. Because entangled with his economic mayhem, with the congregation of enablers for Trump, they are literally trying to unmoor our nation from the rule of law. We hear that phrase a lot, the rule of law, and with our economy heading toward a cliff, I think one of the things as a country we need, and not everyone's going to have time to think about this, they're trying to feed their kids, they've got 2 or 3 jobs, but it is important to make the case on democracy and why it is important. And it's actually a legitimate question when it comes to the economy. And my answer is everything we hold faith in across the country, including our economy, is glued together by law. The law allows us to participate in our democracy whenever we choose to say, read, or write without fear of retribution. But it also allows an economic system, a capitalistic system, to thrive. Sometimes good, sometimes bad, but it is based in law. We know the way it has worked in the modern pre-Trump era is that you can start a business, you can enter into a contract without the risk of being targeted by the government, old days, right? Or have a competitor unjustly favored by the government, or have the president enact unilateral tariff taxes that decimate your financial security, or even stop guaranteed contracts that are at the current state threatening our agriculture economy. It's even mundane stuff. Having a rule of law allows us to have things like patents, right? So people can own their intellectual property. Allows us to have things like copyrights, which differentiates us from other countries that don't protect intellectual property, and the state steals all of it, and it's actually been one of our big competitive advantages that we have the rule and law in place. So why do you think the president goes ahead and fires who? Not just the Librarian of Congress, most incredible friend of mine, Carla Hayden. Every Rules Committee meeting I ever chaired was a ranking on for the last, 8 years or so. Not one Republican ever said a bad word about her. And we had an oversight hearing every single year. Well, along with that, kind of hidden in the not in the headlines, was that he also fired the head of the U.S. Copyright Office. Having rules in place for our economy, the rule of law, allows for approval of complex technologies like medical devices, drug treatment, which, when done right, and making sure unsafe products out there are not out there, can save lives and be an economic boon to our country. Finally, the rule of law, which I'm sure you've talked about today, allows us to freely walk the street without the threat of being whisked away to challenge wrongdoing against us, and equally so, to put up a fair challenge if someone is accused of something. Yet, as you know, last Friday we heard from Stephen Miller, Donald Trump's deputy chief of staff say with barely restrained glee that the government is actively looking at suspending habeas corpus, which you know is the right each of us has to challenge imprisonment and detention. In other words, the White House is dangling the idea of indefinitely detaining people with no charges, no recourse, no trial, lock you up, throw away the key. Now, I have my own beliefs that he does this kind of thing on a Friday, so you get asked about it on the Sunday show, but it doesn't make it any less scary what they are doing and what they are threatening to do. This is actually something that Supreme Court Justice David Souter, who sadly passed away this last week, warned us back in 2012, before Trump even ran for office. When problems get bad enough, he said, one person will come forward and say, give me total power and I will solve this problem. That is how the Roman Republic fell. Those are Souter's words, not mine. I thought it was a pretty good quote. Those words ring truer than ever today, more than a decade later. Look, no reasonable person believes that our American society, which we cherish and value, is free of illness. And no reasonable Democrat believes we should maintain the status quo. We must make changes. And this last election was a change election. And I think one of our issues, which you all know, is that we must be the people of change. We must make cases of why we need more affordable housing, why we need to build more affordable housing, why we need to do more on clean energy and make it easier to get clean energy projects going, why we must bring down costs of child care and health care and be out there with bold ideas. But as the late Justice Souter suggested, the societal illness that should concern us most is the open attempt to demagogue our problems as a means to consolidate problems in the hands of a few. So this is the side of the presidency I'm going to focus on tonight, this sweeping, unabashed, and anti-democratic power grab. In these 115 days, many of us are seeing in bright letters the warning signs of tyranny, something some of your panelists talked about tonight. We cannot forget that our system of government was set up by the framers of the Constitution to avert the exact kind of power grab moments we're witnessing every day with this administration. And let me just tell you something. If you're asked whether your job as president is to uphold the Constitution, as Donald Trump was on national TV the other week, I promise you the answer is, I don't know. Got to talk to the lawyers. As James Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers, the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. So reading that out loud, there you're applauding for James Madison, the Virginia senators would be very happy, gives me flashbacks to Inauguration Day. I promised I would bring this up. So I chaired that and took it on a year before we knew who was going to win. I will note, as he mentioned my book, I sure have another book in me when I am the only person in the world to have ever ridden alone in a car for 20 minutes with Joe Biden and Donald Trump. True story. Yeah. But my big focus that day was that I had 4 minutes to speak at the inauguration, and I was the only person of my political party that had that right and ability. So I decided I would share some things. I wrote every single word myself, and I decided I wanted to share some things that I thought would meet the test of time. The first was this: our democracy is a hot mess. It has been, and it's even more right now. But it's on all of us to be the shelter in the storm. That's a Bob Dylan quote. I liked A Complete Unknown really a lot, and I thought it should win the Academy Awards, so I decided to put a quote from Bob Dylan in my inaugural address, okay? But shelter from the storm, and that means that we need to cherish it and hold it up. Second, in some countries, the inauguration for a president is held in a gilded presidential palace or an executive office building. In our country, it is held in the people's house for a reason. And that is because under the Constitution, we have 3 equal branches of government. And that is something that we need to hold on to dearly, no matter what the rubber stamp Republicans are doing right now when it comes to some of these nominees and some of these votes. And third, and this was something I could add when the president made the decision to bring the inauguration inside. So it was there in the rotunda. You all remember well the tech bros standing in front of the cabinet nominees. But the point of it was this. My third point was that the power in that room, whether it was for a freshman member of Congress or the President of the United States, did not come from within that room. It came from outside of that rotunda. And that is all of you, and that is the people of this country. So what has happened since then? So this balance in our government, that is to be the check on tyranny. And I think you know that every day the Trump administration is pulling hard on the threads dangling from that sweater of our democracy. And you often think, how long before this unravels? You think I don't think it? I do. But I find faith, as this last panel at the end was talking about, and I'm sure Skye mentioned at length, is in what the courts are doing right now, including Trump nominees, including Bush nominees, and yes, there are clearly some Reagan nominees still out there, as well as, of course, Biden and Obama and Clinton judges. It's not perfect. It will never be perfect. You know how conservative the Supreme Court is, but they do feel like they see the courts, the lower courts we've seen, a number of them, their place in deciding the law and their moment in history. But what I keep seeing as I keep looking at what the administration is doing as a whole when you step back from the individual acts, and I keep seeing what it's about is a consolidation of power, an attempt to take away from that balance from the other branches of government. And what does it remind me of? It reminds me a bit of a monopoly. In the work that I did on the antitrust book, when you see when big interests and when people want to just get rid of every single thing that's a check on them. Yes, my antitrust book came out in the middle of the pandemic, and if you all remember, since Michael brought up the presidential race, that Pete and I had a bit of a rivalry. We were actually friends, just to be very clear. But when the race ended, Pete wrote a book right away that got on the New York Times bestseller list called Trust. Not to be outdone, 9 months later, I wrote a book called Antitrust. So that book is a big book, and it is about consolidation of power. I've been writing it for like 6-7 years, actually, into it, because that's my subcommittee that I chaired for so long. So what about when you consolidate? You know what happens when you do what happens when economic power is consolidated. There isn't competition. Small businesses don't have a chance. They buy things so they can make themselves bigger and bigger. You hear some of it in the cases right now with Facebook, right? The line of Mark Zuckerberg, the immortal line in the email. Oh, is he out there? Sorry. The immortal line where he said, "I'd rather buy than compete." Yes, that's true. So what happens when you consolidate political power, when you try to form a monopoly out of the Oval Office? So one, and let's look at it that way, the president is trying to remake the executive office into one that is immune from outside accountability. He's engaged in an unprecedented overreach that disregards the rule of law and pretends as if the independent judiciary is a bug rather than a feature of our system. He's bypassing Congress to make unilateral decisions on spending and torpedo the economy with the tariff taxes. He's engaging in punitive attacks on the legal industry, education, and even individual people. I come to mind Chris Krebs, who was safeguarding our election during the last Trump administration from foreign interference and cyber attacks, who had the audacity to say the election was safe and that it was correct. And that, of course, were the same words of Trump's Attorney General at the time, Bill Barr. But Chris Krebs gets fired immediately. And now what's happened in the second Trump administration, the president is back threatening an investigation of this same man. That has happened to a number of people, as you all know. He's targeting and bullying companies, nonprofits, the news media, and even having his attorney general threaten to subpoena journalists who, quote, undermine President Trump's policies. So that's the first part of this. Number two, absent any accountability, he is free to corrupt our highest office, to exact political retribution and increase his own personal gain and the gain of his friends. He's taken the watchdogs of our government, like the DOJ and the FCC, and turned them into attack dogs, wielding them as personal weapons. He's hollowed out the regulators and agencies like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Consumer Product Safety Commission. Senator Blumenthal and I did an event with the three commissioners that were fired today. Hundreds and hundreds of recalls of unsafe products. Now that agency is dysfunctional, and they are talking about folding, not them, the administration, that they want to get rid of it. Imagine the power that will give companies, for those of us that fought against lead in toys and finally did something about it, unsafe pool drains. These are things that there have always been bipartisan agreement on. He's conducting personal enrichment schemes like the meme coin, the free luxury jumbo jet, as well as the direct transfer of wealth into billionaire backers. And three, as he seeks unchecked power, Trump is eliminating competition in our democratic process as well as our economic marketplace. He's stamping out political competition by targeting access to the ballot box, restricting voting rights, gutting the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, as was mentioned by our friend from the Brennan Center, and attacking organizations like Act Blue that facilitate participation in elections. At the same time, he's picking in winners and losers in the economy. So he does those tariffs, right? So remember when they had the meeting in the White House, and Tim Cook was able to call him on the phone? A small business owner in Minnesota named Beth Beneke, who owns a company, she's a veteran, called Busy Baby. My husband, when I told him, thought I said lazy baby. Busy Baby. And she's been very successful, Minnesota Entrepreneur of the Year, small business, employs a few people. She is going to be decimated by this. She doesn't have the number for Donald Trump. She can't get an exemption from the tariffs like major CEOs can get. She was not invited by J.P. Morgan to that meeting with the Treasury Secretary. She has no access to find out what tariffs are going to go away and when they're going to go away in order to make her investments decisions. Nor does the soybean farmer I met a few weeks ago on my 19-county rural tour across Minnesota. They are literally throwing out the rule book, because when you start making these kinds of tariffs, even the existing ones that remain in place with our friends in Canada and Mexico, with our allies that have stood with us in 2 world wars in Europe, with our allies like Japan and South Korea that are a counterweight to China. When he messes around like that and then gives exemptions to some people and not others, when it comes to China, that's where you get corruption. I'd like to share something that the Federalist Society, I'm just going to keep quoting conservatives, right? Co-founder Stephen Calabrese wrote in the Minnesota Law Review in 1999. And this is about, remember how Trump has called for all these judges to be impeached. The VP has said, Vance, judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. Calabrese said this. He said a system in which the president had the power to defy court judgments, quote, would be not so much a system of constitutional government as it would be a system of rule by an elected Napoleonic strongman. Yeah, it was 1999, but you can still use it. Republican or Democrat, past presidents have understood this. Eisenhower honored his, quote, inescapable duty to enforce the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education. Minutes after the Supreme Court ordered Truman to give up control of striking steel plants in Youngstown, Ohio, he did that. Nixon, albeit not exactly a legal guy, surrendered the Watergate tapes when ordered by the court. As Justice Robert Jackson said in that landmark case, in the Youngstown case about the presidency, the purpose of the Constitution was not only to grant power, but to keep it from getting out of hand. So now we ask ourselves, what can be done? Who is stepping up? How do we, to borrow from Justice Jackson, keep this from getting even more out of hand? Above all else, as I noted in that 4-minute inauguration speech, true power comes from the people. Americans are waking up to the reality that Donald Trump betrayed them. I mentioned the polling numbers, and I have my proof points right now from the Wisconsin Supreme Court race. I was there. We flipped 10 Trump counties, and that was a nationalized race, and it wasn't all about Elon Musk, even though he looked stupid in a cheese cat. It really wasn't only about that. It was about the rural areas and the tariffs, and it was about all your individual rights and all kinds of things. Omaha, just yesterday, right? An upset race in Omaha, in that blue dot. Even people who voted for Trump are speaking up, and they're saying this isn't what we signed up for. One of my favorite town halls in a small town of less than 500 people, something with the Farmers Union. And so you have this mixture when you're in those things. They're not the big, high school gyms or big auditoriums that can be very energizing and cool. In there, you got these farmers that are like, did I really come to this thing? Did I come to this thing? I've never been at anything. And there was this one where this farmer was sitting next to a woman who was probably with Indivisible, an activist, and she held up this sign that said, "This is not normal." And before it started, I heard him go, "What does that mean?" She goes, "Well, I mean, this isn't normal." He goes, "But I'm normal." She goes, "No, you're normal. I just mean this isn't normal." So what I'm saying is sometimes voices like that who are willing to come up to a microphone or not come up to a microphone and just come up to you later and talk to you about it are just as important as the ones that are holding up the signs. And that is what we are seeing across the country right now. These people thought he was going to do something, because I know I had a bunch of people that voted for me and Donald Trump in the last election. He thought they were going to do something to fix child care, that he was, health care, housing. He's doing the opposite. So they're getting mad, and they're getting even more mad because of the tumult created by these tariffs. Next, we have scores of courageous individuals. And when you look at, so you got the people out there that are rising up in all different ways, not just one way, but all different ways. And I hope you remember that when you think about it next time. We have courageous individuals, you've heard some today, who are risking their careers and their livelihoods to take a principled stand. I'm talking about prosecutors who declined to do Trump's bidding, universities and law firms that refuse to bend the knee to the administration, lawyers putting themselves in the crosshairs by challenging government overreach, and judges who are continuing to apply the law even as their families are targeted. I'm reminded of what Hagen Schotten, who was lead prosecutor in the Eric Adams case, a conservative who had worked for conservative judges, veteran. He resigned instead of carrying out politicized orders, and he wrote, "I expect you will eventually find someone who is enough of a fool or enough of a coward to file your motion, but it was never going to be me." And he resigned. So when you look for heroes, some of these heroes are people that you may not agree with them about other stuff that they say, but that's part of a democracy, right? Some of these people who are standing up right now may not be perfect, and they may not do everything you want, including some members of the Senate and the House. But the fact is they're standing up in so many ways that they can. There are brave people putting themselves in harm's way on behalf of America's values, and we cannot minimize, ignore, or forget their tough choice to be on the right side of history. Finally, we need, as I've said like 3 times today, rubber stamp Republicans in Congress to step up and show some courage. It only takes 4 people in the House to stand up right now. You'd have a different budget. Yeah, I'd blow my nose over that too. It only takes 4 people in the Senate. As you could see with Tim Kaine and I put up a resolution on the Canadian border and that it wasn't really an emergency, so he had no authority to do the tariffs. We got 2 senators on the Republican side that bordered Canada, always the states where you can see Canada from your porch, easier, vote with us. And then the 2 senators who don't really agree on much from Kentucky, Mitch McConnell and Rand Paul, but what do they agree on? Kentucky bourbon, you want it on the shelves in Canada. So those four. And so that is just, it's one crack, but it's a crack. The next test is on Medicaid cuts to pay for billionaire tax handouts, and hopefully also on Trump's monopoly power over our government. These are places where we need to make a big, big stand together. One of my favorite votes late in the night where we push people to take a stand, push the Republicans, was Elizabeth's idea, and maybe you've seen the video of it. But she said, okay, could you at least agree that we shouldn't reduce taxes on people making over $50 million a year? And they all yell out, no. Oh, there we go. That's me. Oh, you're looking up my inaugural ceremonies. Yeah, it was an official role. That was me. Yeah. Secondly, we had Mark Kelly, who may not be the first person to come to mind who's going to do this thing with Elizabeth, but he felt really strongly about it. And he said, okay, well, how about for people making over $100 million a year? Can we agree we shouldn't reduce their taxes? They all yell out, no. And then finally it ends with Angus King, the independent of Maine, saying, okay, how about people making over $500 million a year? At least we can agree we shouldn't reduce their taxes. They yell out, no. And right now, that bill that they have over in the House, we just got the numbers from the Joint Taxation Committee, it will give millionaires an average tax cut of $80,000. Okay, so that's what we're dealing with as they look at how they're going to pay for things. They're looking in all the wrong places, at Medicaid, at cancer trials, and all these things. So that is the case we're making on that. And through it all, as we mobilize, we need to be as strong as the people, in our cases, that we represent and that are your friends and neighbors. We need to be strong as a small business that's doing all it can to struggle under these tariffs. We need to be unshakable like the scientists and research who are still waiting for their grants to come through, but doing all they can to keep their trials going to fight childhood cancer. We need to be as relentless as the mom and dad working double shifts and overtime to cover the rising costs of their child care. And we need to be as brave as every single person who has shown their grit over the past 150 days. So if that is not enough to inspire you and you still want to wallow, don't wallow. Watch these people and see them as your heroes. Thank you.
And now for our final panel, How Do We Resist Trump? Please welcome Leah Greenberg, Tiana Mays, Maria Stephen, and Timothy Noah.
Thank you for your patience. We are the last panel tonight, but we're the best panel, so you got that coming. We're going to talk about how you resist Trump. And we have today Leah Greenberg, who is the co-founder of Indivisible. We have Maria Stephan, who is the co-lead and chief organizer of the Horizons Project. And we have Tiana Mays, who's legal director, State Democracy Defenders Action. And I am Timothy Noah, and I got this assignment because I wrote an article on how to resist Donald Trump, and we have copies of that waiting for you as you leave. That's also the subject of our panel, how to resist Trump. And I will start with Leah. What are your thoughts about the best strategies for stopping Trump?
Well, let's see. So So maybe just very quickly, I represent Indivisible, which is a grassroots movement of thousands of local indivisible groups. These are non-formal grassroots communities organized all over the country, people who came together to take action to resist the MAGA agenda wherever they are. And, you know, we really believe that the first and most important step is getting together in community wherever you are. We are facing a moment in which the Trump and fascist agenda relies on convincing people that they are powerless and that they are alone. And so the first piece that we advocate collectively is for folks to get into community and to start looking for answers together. We then think about how we apply the leverage that we have, right? Indivisible's bread and butter is really around talking to people about how do you organize locally in order to make your elected officials listen to you. And even in this moment, and even recognizing kind of the ways in which the political system has been intentionally made, you know, hardened against kind of popular advocacy, there are really important levers that we believe that people can push if they organize locally, both to move Democrats into an actively oppositional position and also to push Republicans on their support for Donald Trump, their support for the MAGA agenda, their support for key legislative initiatives that can actually shift the needle and ultimately create meaningful accountability for people who are backing the Trump agenda. Now, more broadly in this moment, we think that it is going to be really crucial to build and to demonstrate a broad popular opposition that creates the conditions for courage, for opposition, for resistance in all four corners of society. If we are going to get through this period of time, a large number of people in places that I will never fully understand for myself will need to do things that the administration does not want them to do, and will need to not do things that the administration wants them to do. And so what we focus on across Indivisible is really how do we mobilize that big, bold, popular opposition that shows up, that shows in every corner of the country that there is power in standing up against this administration, and that gives other people the courage and the confidence to do so in whatever space that they may be, whether that is their university, whether that is in their job or their workplace, whether that is in their faith community, however they can show up in the world and use their own levers of power, asking them to do so and to step forward.
And let me add, you have a very, very useful guide posted. I forget the name of it. It's posted online.
That's right. That's right. So our origin is actually that we write guides. We got started in late 2016 when my husband and I, as former congressional staffers, wrote a guide to organizing locally to replicate the model that we had seen deployed by the Tea Party to oppose President Obama's agenda. Replicating that in order to try to stop the attack on the Affordable Care Act and the congressional agenda of the then incoming Trump administration. Thousands of people formed groups, started organizing locally. We were suddenly organizing with them. We built out an organization to support. As conditions change, we continue to write and adapt guidance about how do you actually strategically use your own leverage in order to make the greatest change. And so we push people to think, where are you? If you're in a blue state, is your governor, is your attorney general, are your state legislators doing everything that they can to push back against MAGA overreach and to defend your population and folks across the country? Is your senator and your representative doing everything that they can to push back and raise the alarm? If you're represented in a purple area, is that representative going along with the Trump agenda, or are they incurring political costs? So advocating to try and shift the political currents. We talk about it as fight to win, fight to delay, fight to make it hurt, wherever we're opposing the Project 2025 agenda. And then all over the country, organizing in solidarity and defying their efforts to divide us, because fundamentally this is a divide and conquer agenda that focuses on going after marginalized populations and cowing the rest of us into submission. And every act of solidarity is an act of defiance of that agenda.
And again, the name of that handbook?
Sure. Indivisible, A Practical Guide to Democracy on the Brink.
Yes, and everybody really should download that. It's full of wonderful, very specific practical information for novices. And really, you can't look at this guidebook and throw up your hands and say, I don't know what to do. It really walks you through it. Maria, can you tell us about the sort of protest realm and what the possibilities are there?
Right. So good evening, everyone. So I've spent the past 25 years or so working with and writing about movements in this country and around the world that have fought for basic human rights, fundamental freedoms, democracy. And these movements have challenged autocratic regimes. And, you know, the singular finding of research and practice on how to resist authoritarianism is through mass, diverse movements that bring people together across sector, across pillar, across geography, that engage in various forms of collective action. And so mass, diverse participation in movements is the strongest bulwark against authoritarianism around the world. And we know that when movements involve workers, when they involve faith leaders, business leaders, students, ordinary people engaged in various acts of non-cooperation or defiance, these are the movements, whether it's Chile, whether it's South Africa, whether it's Poland, these are the movements that are able to push back effectively against authoritarianism. Because some of the secret sauce to effective anti-authoritarian resistance is being able to withdraw the sources of social, political, and economic power that these regimes need to maintain control. So when, you know, businesses no longer provide economic support, when workers withdraw their labor, when students and teachers walk out or don't cooperate in ways that they're expected to, when faith leaders stop offering moral sanction, this is when autocratic regimes lose their power. And we've seen this most recently. And, you know, there's been research done on when you have democratic backsliding happening, what turns it around? And one of the recent studies by two scholars, Jonathan Pinckney and Claire Trilling, found that if you do not have a civil resistance movement, the chances of turning around democratic backsliding is about 7.5%. If you have an active civil resistance movement, it's about 51.7%. And so you look at cases, even most recently, think about Poland, the mass mobilization against the far-right autocratic Law and Justice Party that was backsliding, attacking the judiciary, undermining checks and balances. You saw out in the streets lawyers and judges in their robes walking out of courtrooms to demonstrate defiance. You've seen in Brazil, in the pushback against Bolsonaro, you saw business conglomerates who joined forces with unions, with faith groups, with civic associations to condemn the anti-democratic behavior. So the key, and think about our own history of resisting authoritarianism in this country. The civil rights movement, our greatest pro-democracy movement to undermine racial authoritarianism. It was students, it was faith leaders, it was unions uniting under jobs and freedom that led some of the most effective non-cooperation campaigns, the lunch counter sit-ins, the freedom rides, the bus boycotts. These were the organized campaigns that ultimately dismantled an authoritarian system. And that is, I believe, how we will win.
And my sense is that this work has already begun, that we're seeing rapid mobilization. It's early days yet, but where do you see encouraging signs right now?
We're seeing mobilization across the country. I mean, this myth that where is the opposition is that. It's a myth. There's an entity, the Crowd Counting Consortium, that has been tracking protests across the country. And they found that, in fact, there were more protests between January and March of this year, 3 times as many protests compared to 8 years ago. So not only do you have the massive demonstrations like April 5th Hands Off, like the May Day rallies. So you have 3.5 million people, I think, came out for Hands Off. You're starting to see other acts of more muscular non-cooperation. So the Tesla takedown, which helped kind of wedge Trump and Musk. So, you had stock prices of Tesla plummet as a result of the protests, divestment, boycotts of Tesla. So you're starting to see more muscular forms of action. You're starting to see people put up billboards, welcome to Rocky Mountain National Park, with reduced staff thanks to Doge. So there are like acts of defiance happening all across the country, and that's there's a tremendous amount to build on.
Just one final question. We saw the Newark mayor go to jail, and I've been thinking since January 20th that this is going to be a protest movement where some people are going to have to go to jail to make their point. Do you see that in the future?
I mean, civil disobedience, which is the intentional break and knowing defiance of laws and paying the consequences, has been a part of many movements for rights, freedoms, democracy, particularly in authoritarian settings. And, it's certainly part of our history in this country. So I think, civil disobedience can really emphasize the urgency of the moment. And when people demonstrate that they're willing to make sacrifices in that way, willing to pay the price, go to prison, suffer consequences, it raises the sense that, yes, people are willing to take significant risk to be able to defend democracy. So I think, civil disobedience is not for everyone, but everyone can participate in forms of defiance and non-cooperation. Gene Sharp, back in the day, came up with 198 methods of nonviolent action that have all different kinds of things that people can do, social, political, economic cooperation. So I think it's helping people find the ways in their lives, in the workplace, in their faith communities, that they can say no, stubbornly say no to what this regime is about, and yes, to an inclusive multiracial democracy.
Wonderful. Tiana, you are part of what has been the most visible and most successful piece of the resistance thus far, which is the legal realm. Trump is actually losing in the courts. He's losing most cases. And we're still groping to find a way to enforce court decisions. But what are your thoughts on the state of play right now?
Sure. I think when we look at in the first approximately 100 days, I wanted to say about 150-ish lawsuits were filed, challenging a lot of the decisions and the actions of the administration. And what we saw, as you indicated, is we saw the courts responding in kind, and we did see a lot of wins. And we're continuing to experience a lot of wins. As recently as Friday, we saw the court in California hold that mass reorganization that's been happening in the federal government, which basically is just them trying to completely break down our federal government. We found that, or the court found that there was granted a TRO in that case. And basically what that is it granted a restraining order and found that that likely runs afoul of the Constitution and is illegal. And so, what we've seen is, to Maria's point about the different folks and what people can do to resist and to push back and to fight, we've seen folks from not just those that have law degrees or not just those that are in different, in academia. We've seen a lot of folks that I was talking to on the phone, and I said, look, for some people, resistance is going to be putting your head down and staying at your job in that seat, if you can. For some people, it is taking a step, and some folks are becoming whistleblowers. For some people, like the courageous people that I represent in a lot of my cases, we have Jane and John Does who've all come forward at a great risk to themselves, personally, financially. A lot of them have been attacked online just because of the type of work they do, whether it's through USAID or whether it was through the FBI agents who worked on any of the J6 cases. And so that is what we're seeing with our work, too, with what it looks like to have this resistance and this movement in this moment. And, one of the challenges with our work is that the courts are reactionary, and it's difficult to run in and stop something even when you see the freight train coming, you're basically waiting for them to drop enough breadcrumbs and to give you enough so that you can file exactly when the moment is right. And that can be very disheartening to some folks because some damage has to be done at some point for us to be able to get a remedy from the courts. And so while we have had successes in the courts, it's come at a very large, I would say, human cost for people. We've seen the dismantling of agencies in our government and what that looks like across not just this area, but also how it is back home and what folks are dealing with in different states and just across the U.S. and across the world because of what's happened with a lot of the other agencies. And so I do think it's really important as we're thinking about ways that we can either fight back, push back, respond, or show up in this moment. I think it's really important to, yes, celebrate the wins because he is losing in court and we are winning. And for us, like Leah said, sometimes you're stopping it, sometimes you're winning. I think you said sometimes you're either stopping it.
Fight to win, fight to delay, fight to make it hurt.
There you go. So sometimes we're winning, sometimes we're delaying, and by delaying, that means that more people are getting rights. Those probationary employees are no longer probationary. Now they have certain rights that they can vindicate through different channels because of employment. One of our clients said to us, she said, I just needed another week because now I can get my full retirement. So like some of this is you're delaying, we're winning, but also we're making it hurt. And because of that, this perception of the administration wins everything and shows up, and we're seeing them retreat in a lot of different places. And we're also seeing that this isn't an issue that's based on political affiliation. We're seeing that in particular with the due process, the attacks on our due process rights. And I would say everyone's seen that, I would say, play out in particular with the folks who are just the migrants who are being taken and flown here, flown there, moved to this spot, moved to that spot. And even people who I would say just a few months ago were the loudest supporters, folks have a problem when you start pulling people off the streets and not giving people due process rights and then all of a sudden act like you're a king and that you don't have to answer to anyone and you don't have to respond because it becomes very real. And the idea that, oh, that could never happen to me then becomes something of, wait, that could happen to me. And if that does happen, who's going to show up? And so, in that moment and with this movement where we are now, what I see our job as the most important part of my job is to just hold it back, hold this at bay, push it back, fight as hard as I can while those that are building the movement, those that are in the streets, those that are working, they're showing up and we're giving them the space, the power, the freedom, whatever it is that they need, however we can, because we're doing our small part to allow that movement to take hold and continue to push back so that we can actually see something that ends up turning this thing around, as Maria was talking about.
Let me ask you about something a lot of us are worried about, which is what happens when the administration is in outright defiance against a court order. I think a lot of people feel hopeless about that, but in fact, the courts have a few cards they can play, right?
I mean, the courts do have a few cards they can play, but I will say that the courts can't be the answer here. And I think that's going to be the main problem. You'll see in some of the cases with due process, they walked right up to the edge. Some people will say they put their foot over the line, and then they walked it right back. Because I do think some of these are test cases. They're testing to see just how far they can go to then see what the public outcry will be. How many people will go into the streets? How many people will then respond? What will the businesses do? What will the workers what will everyone do in response to this? And so I do think that, yes, the courts have a few things that the courts can do. You can hold people in contempt. There's a lot of different tools, but they're not really set up for this moment. and for something like this of this magnitude. And that's when I think that we have to pull back and relying on the courts, and we have to remember the power of grassroots movement, those who are mobilizing, and those who are literally like putting their bodies and their livelihoods on the front line and on the line, because that's what's, I honestly think, to me, that's what's going to be the stop. That's going to be what stops this, and that's going to be the real consequence.
Leah, you said something to me when I wrote my piece that I was very taken with. You talked about the fundamental stupidity of Trump's political strategy in that he was going after everybody. He was not conserving a group of people who could be his supporters. He was, he's going after Wall Street. He's going after the military. He's not leaving himself any natural allies. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. So what I was speaking about was sort of in general, and I feel silly talking about this on the same stage as Maria, who is like the leading expert on all of this. But a successful authoritarian regime has like their core bases of support, and they try to work to keep their coalition happy, right? And Donald Trump has a much more stable or much more fluid relationship with a bunch of the core parts of his coalition right now. They have been doing a ton of things that are going directly at the well-being of rural folks, that are going directly at red states' economies, that are undermining kind of basic stability conditions for businesses. You really want to have, the core parts of your own coalition happy with you and benefiting, and also you also want to create the conditions in which when you demand compliance from someone, they, doing so, complying actually delivers, a better outcome than not complying. And what we've seen with Trump is that even when he gets some kind of obedience, when he gets some kind of gesture of compliance, like with Columbia University or with the law firms, he comes back for more. And so it actually kind of undermines the fundamental case for, if you're any individual actor, whether you should be falling in line with the Trump administration or whether you should be trying to eke out some kind of posture of resistance with them, because even compliance does not in any way guarantee that you're not going to face future rounds of penalization and him coming after you.
You're talking about compliance makes me think about the case of Harvard, where Harvard was ready to deal. And because Trump was, again, very strategically stupid about this, he or somebody at HHS overrode the negotiating team and presented a much more extreme list of demands. And Harvard, which has, I wrote about this, virtually no history of institutional bravery about anything, it had no choice. It had to say absolutely not. And it seems to me that we are going to see other institutions react the same way. And Maria, I was wondering if you could speak to that point.
Yeah, I think the Harvard story, yes, the demands were then extreme and hyperbolic and the like, but Harvard people organized also. So you had faculty, students, people were like, we are not following Columbia. And so there was pushback. The American Association of University Professors, AAUP, which had put out a statement against anticipatory obedience and was very active on campus. So you had a lot of different groups who were organizing, so it became necessary for the administration to reject the deal. So I think there were definitely a lot of factors at play, and we're seeing, to Leah's point, I think the first 100 days of the administration, early on, he was quite effective at picking people off one by one, whether it's media outlets, whether it was the law firms, whether it was the universities, and so then people wised up. And the lesson was, we are not safe if we just keep our heads down and assume that, they're not going to come for us. So then it became about, we do need to organize together. Law firms do need to come together and agree we're not going to go along. So, and you know, the Georgetown law students now who have come up with a list of the biggest law firms to rate them, like who has capitulated to the administration, who is in like actively resisting, and everyone in between. So there's got to be like a collective mindset. Rutgers University put out a mutual defense pact amongst Big Ten schools. So like an attack on one is an attack on all. Unions similarly are engaging in more creative collective action. So that's the name of the game, is collective action. It's the best guarantor of security, and it's the way to go on offense against autocrats.
Tiana, I'd like to just sort of raise the question of immigration, because that was one area I was a little embarrassed when I finished my piece and looked it over and realized I didn't write about immigration. And it was unconscious. And I think probably the reason I didn't write about it is the hardest area because there are the fewest legal protections. Do you have thoughts about what is possible in the area of pushing back against these really savage acts by the Trump administration against law-abiding citizens, law-abiding non-citizens?
Sure, and I think to Maria's point, you're seeing that happen with the coalitions coming together to push back and what it looks like to come up with creative solutions. And I think that one of the main promises that he ran on and that he said was that, you know, in the first 100 days, he was going to deport the most people. It was this whole thing. Of course, it was the narrative about violence and criminals. And clearly what we've seen is also that he hasn't deported the most people. It's not just people who he said would have certain criminal records. He's, you know, really just taking a sledgehammer approach. The same approach that he's taken to the federal government is the same approach he's taken to really kind of everything. And so with that, what we've seen is our partners in the space, we've done some work, but we've also seen Democracy Forward, we've seen ACLU, we've seen a lot of the groups that have always been on the front line for immigrants' rights. We've seen that when the funding was cut for some of those groups that represent the children who are unaccompanied minors, we saw people pushing back in that space too. And so, you know, I think that, yes, there are legal protections aside, there are certain due process rights, and there are certain processes that have to occur, whether we're talking about federal employment decisions or sometimes whether we're talking about, in this case, immigration. And the one thing about this administration, 1.0 and 2.0, is that they don't follow process or rules. In Trump 1.0, he had an 80% he lost 80% of his cases. The administration lost 80% of their cases because they don't follow the rules and they just don't follow the basic concepts. And so I do think that you're going to continue to see that. The problem is the carnage, right, that we're seeing, and the real cost and what these folks are going to go through in the meantime. And I think he's counting on or hoping that he's going to bend so much that people are going to break. But I think that he has completely, because maybe he can't understand it, he doesn't understand the resiliency and the strength of not only just the American people, the fabric of it, like the human person and the will, but also the migrants that made the journey to come here and to work hard and to do everything they can for their families, whether it's back home or whether it's here. So he's completely underestimated that, and he's underestimated the community that will continue to stand with them and to fight with them and to tell their stories and to make sure that we're doing everything we can so that these folks have due process and that they are abiding by the law. And so that's what I would say when you're asking about, you know, how is it that we respond in a situation that at times can feel so hopeless?
Well, with that, I just want to say I feel like I've seen the end of this movie and Trump loses. But he only loses if everybody in the audience does something to resist him. And it really is required of all of us. But I feel very confident with these three leaders working around the clock, and with the capacity of this burgeoning protest movement to resist, that there will be a lot of carnage and it will be awful, but that Trump will be defeated. I don't even seriously believe he's going to serve 4 years in office. I think one way or another he will be tossed out. And on that hopeful note, that concludes our program. I was told that the Atlas Center is one of the places that has been defunded by the federal government in the last couple of weeks. And I would urge all of you to consider logging on to the Atlas Center website and making a contribution to try and make up for the loss of federal support.